And just to say, my apologies that my introduction, it doesn't live up to Mr. Verges, Dr. Verges. But, hopefully it's good enough. Have you still got me?
Yeah.
Ce soir, je te suis.
Welcome to the unfortunately postponed seminar 9 of Greats in Thought. Dr. Luke Alexander Buckley was swamped by hay fever last week, for which he apologizes. In this seminar, we will consider once again Foucault's Psychiatric Power, Lectures 7 and 8, in which we will encounter sadist psychiatry, reality as a brick wall to be enforced, and the genius of Monsieur Dupré. We grow here with the giats, like algae, who grow with the phosphorus from piss. We sit and stew in a pissy pool and try to make something of ourselves. Like algae, we arrive like disgusting strips of tattered vegetables on the beach. Like algae, we live just beneath the surface. Like algae, we live and feed off excrement. And like algae, we exude amidst the shit and the pissy pool we stew in, the essential minerals of life. Take off your nappies, unbutton your pants, lean over the toilet thinking why, and throw up. This is Greats in Thought. There is no road nor map. Proceed with caution. Greats in Thought. Read, riff, rapscalionate. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Greats in Thought.
Well. The boys are back in town. How you doing?
Good.
Can you hear me?
Good.
Yeah, can hear you. Yeah, I forgot you were talking to me. I always wonder who this like mysterious, opaque, nameless fourth person is, that we're all addressing.
Yeah, wondering like the algae.
Exactly. There you go.
All right, so last week I was just constantly sneezing. I had this like wild hay fever. I had to, because I hadn't told you guys how to like run the thing and do the thing. I had to postpone. But this week we're back. We're resuming. We're from from Mary Douglas and the kind of materiality and grip and grist of Mary Douglas, and back onto Foucault and Le Pouvoir Psychiatrique and lectures 7, and 8. And there are all sorts of things, all sorts of reasons why, you know, I thought that the little détournement to Mary Douglas was, you know, important. So I just wanted to start with like a few remarks, because I was just thinking through my head about this, and it's especially the 7th lecture, which is kind of premonitory to the 8th, right? You know, like the 8th lecture systematizes and kind of like establishes what is more fully realized in the 7th lecture. And again, it's me continuing to advocate a certain way of thinking about and reading Foucault, in which we allow him like a looseness and tentativeness, in which, you know, I will. We've spoken about this personally, but I haven't said it on the shows or the stream yet. You know, I'm always in a really difficult situation as we move through Foucault, which is just our first phase, right? I'm actually quite excited about. I was speaking to Jakob about looking into psychoanalysis. You know, Freud, Jung, Reich, Lacan, and then, you know, other psychoanalysts that he could you know, bring to the table that, you know, he knows about. Laplanche is a big one. Christopher is not a psychoanalyst, but she's a brilliant theorist of, you know, these similar kind of ideas. I think we could get like Bataille in there. I think that would be a really nice place to move to after Foucault, and before this ever expanding Triple H, you know, where we look at Hegel, Heidegger, Hume, Hobbes, Marx. You know, I mean, shit's gonna get fucking really interesting and crazy then, because it's gonna be some tight reading, you know. Like Jakob was struggling with Foucault's lectures, so let's see how he goes when he's got fucking, you know.
He's all right. He's just pretending to struggle.
Spirit. Anyway, so that a few just introductory remarks on these lectures. So it goes like all the way back to the first lecture of Psychiatric Power, and that's the first lecture in which he takes this document from. I mean, I believe it's the archives of the Salpêtrière, which was like what the first asylum, or like, you know, the first kind of mental institution. Or, I mean, you never really know with Foucault about his historical references, because he doesn't give them anywhere. But you know that there was this idea conjured in the first lecture, and it was about the asylum is this place. And what was so remarkable about the description was that it was all about this kind of confrontation between the patient and the institution. And so there was this rêve, you know, this dream of the patients who would be like lowered down on these great hydraulic mechanisms, and there would be fireworks and noise and explosions and lights. And then they would meet the doctor, and then, you know, there's this incredibly extensive in the archive list of the qualities of the doctor, right? You know, so the doctor is, you know, I mean, I'd have to have I wouldn't be wearing a French worker's jacket, but, you know, they are upright, you know, they are kind of like vital in Emerson's words. You know, they have like perfect teeth. You know, like the whiteness of their teeth is kind of a point of this discussion or this joust. Now, why? What was the reason for this joust? You know, between the patient and the institution, the asylum, the doctor. Well, it was about the imposition of reality. It was fundamentally about disorienting this person, and at the same time impressing them in such a way. So there are kind of like these two kind of like columns of attack, as it were, on the patient. One is disorientation, right? I mean, you can imagine you're being like lowered on some fucking hydraulic mechanism, lights are going off, fireworks are banging, you're like, what the fuck? And then all of a sudden, all that noise stops, and you land at the bottom, you land in the asylum, and you see what? You see a doctor. And so the joust there is precisely one in which they are trying to impose a new vision, a new view of reality upon the patient. And so this notion of forcing reality, and I thought about it in many different contexts. I thought about it in a conversation I had with Jakob, the other day about like various things. And what's interesting about it is its kind of institutionalization in a psychiatric context, because really the kind of imposition or force of reality is something that is absolutely everyday and absolutely banal. And so the way that I wanted to take this notion of the imposition or forcing of reality was in and through love, and being in love with someone and arguing, fighting, with someone that you are in love with. Now, often those fights or those arguments, they take the stage of a clash of realities. So, like, Jakob, do you mind if I speak for a second about Tia?
Sure.
So, thank you for allowing me to speak about Tia. She's a wonderful, like, brilliant, beautiful woman. And part of your relationship when we spoke together was precisely about a coincidence of reality, because she's from Sweden, she has a similar culture to you. It wasn't like your ex, who I won't mention, or it wasn't like so the point is that part of like the beauty of that relationship is a certain like coincidence of realities. There isn't one culture here and one culture there, and where then therefore you have these kind of arguments in which you try and impose your culture on another person. And I thought the way of thinking about it in and through love, and through the imposition of reality in and through love, I thought it was really interesting because, well, what is the archetypal example of this? Well, it's Don Quixote, or Don Quixote, or Don Quixote, or if you want to pronounce it in Argentinian Spanish, mainland Spanish, or in the English way. Now, what is Don Quixote always doing, and what does that novel do as a work of art? Well, Miguel Cervantes, he wrote Don Quixote, and it was the first novel. Now, it was a satire or parody of precisely courtly romance. There's also a really, really brilliant satire and parody of courtly romance in La Chartreuse de Parme, the Charterhouse of Parma by Stendhal. But, at the time that, Cervantes was writing, this was the 16th century. And as far as we know, this was the first novel. So it was a bit like when I was working on Shadows, there was this, how do I write it? And I wrote it in the form of an epic at first, like a kind of versed epic. And it's because it seemed to me that the subject matter demanded that form. It demanded the epic form because it's a fucking epic story. It's an incredible story. Now, what was the context that Cervantes was writing in? And then this is what's interesting, is that when Cervantes writes, he writes as a kind of intervention into the world. And we've had many conversations about this, and about art, and about the meaning of art, and how, we all have similar feelings about what art should be and what art should do. It should intervene in the world. It should make a change. It should transform. Now, we shouldn't separate the novel from art. We shouldn't separate poetry from art. They are all art. They are all kind of more or less abstract expressions of the human spirit in a particular moment. Now, the tradition of courtly love was not a kind of tradition. It became so in and through literature. Now, that knights, very contrary to the popular misconception, popularized precisely through the kind of literature that Cervantes criticizes, they were fucking nobodies. Knights were losers. This whole kind of game of chivalry and courtship, it was contained within certain kind of books. And so, Cervantes, he wrote this what I see as a parody or a satire of knighthood and of chivalry, and kind of, like a chivalrous form of love. And what's interesting about that, and what's interesting about this chivalrous form of love that Cervantes, in my view, I can see Hatrick's already in there. He's going to tell me I'm wrong as soon as I'm finished. In Cervantes' kind of like critique of in Don Quixote, his critique of these forms of chivalry and these forms of love. Well, what's he always fighting against? He's always fighting against mysteries and illusions. He's the guy who he fights with windmills. He fights against all of these things that we might consider to be like reality, and he fights reality with illusion. So, in a kind of important sense, like in Don Quixote, we are seeing an absolute opposite maneuver to what's happening with Lore. We're seeing an absolute opposite maneuver because in Cervantes' depiction, there is a fight and there is a battle and there is a struggle. But that struggle is against illusion. So it always ends up that, Don Quixote is like fighting, like I said, like a windmill, or like that there's a shadow and he imagines it to be a great king. And, and so he kind of like farcicalizes this whole culture of like courtly love, chivalry. And just a few more things that are interesting about that, and then I want to make some notes about the text specifically, is that within that kind of like culture of courtly love, of chivalry, well, what was the battle for? It was for the love of a woman, right? And so what did the form of love for that woman take? Well, it took the form of a joust, quite literally, or some kind of challenge to the death. And what's interesting when we reflect back on Mary Douglas is that what was the kind of the symbol or the instrument or the vector or carrier of the love of the woman? It was her handkerchief. It was her handkerchief. Now, what do you use a handkerchief for? To sneeze into, to spit in, to kind of like deposit, things that are not socially acceptable. So the handkerchief, in a way, it becomes this like container for a kind of social residual that is not acceptable. Yet that is what her favored knight carries in his joust. Now, when I thought about this, I thought, well, this was quite interesting because is there a cinematic register? So I was thinking about you, Jacob. I was like, is there a cinematic register for this? Well, of course. I mean, it's like the whole fucking history of cinema and love is, the man, and there he has to prove to the woman his love in and through all sorts of trials. Now, the link there to Lore is, of course, like very, very direct and very clear. Because, okay, so, what does Lore talk about in his kind of therapeutics, his orthopedics of the soul of the man? Well, he talks about trials, feats, ordeals in which a certain kind of reality is imposed upon a patient. And so I think that all of those things were really interesting. So firstly, the kind of like imposition of reality. So we return all the way back to the first lecture of psychiatric power and that first scene that he brings from the archives in talking about Salpêtrière. And I think that links in a really interesting way to love and to Don Quixote and to the way in which Don Quixote satirizes this from the exact other perspective. I think it's very interesting at the same time that, that what Don Quixote is satirizing is a certain kind of like culture of courtly chivalry or romance, which has become, I don't know, like kind of de rigueur and standard. And then the last thing I was going to speak about was, of course, Donald Trump. And recently, I don't know if did you see the where he brought the White House. So this is the second time he's done the same show, which again is interesting, right? Show, performance, imposition of reality. So the first time was with Zelensky, and he was like saying, well, him and the I don't know if it's Rubio or Vance. I think it was Vance who was like, you disgrace this house by the way you dress, So he's bringing up all of these elements that are in the first description of this psychiatric institution that Foucault curates and brings to us. And what does he do to Zelensky? Well, he tries to impose a form of reality, and the material elements of the Oval Office he mobilizes and uses it's kind of like an effort to impose this notion of reality on Zelensky. Now, just recently, he did the same thing again with the president. Well, I don't think it was the president. I think it was the ambassador for South Africa. And I don't know if you've actually watched the video, but it is like it is one of the most fucking racist, like insane, you know. And I hate to use a notion like abuse because it's so, you know, it's so misused and it's so misunderstood and it lacks so much meaning. But you know, he in my view, it was like, you know, he got this representative of South Africa into the Oval Office, and then he just abused him. You know, with these images of the guys talking about the white genocide. No, and some of those images were true and were correct, but then other ones he'd like dragged from the Congo, you know, or some other like archival footage of Africa, and yeah, and knowing some white South Africans, you know, definitely there is an element of truth there to what he's talking about. You know, certainly this war against farmers, and I mean, it'd be really great to have have Kian here, who's, you know, part of l'Education Totale and a friend of mine from Oxford, because he's from Joburg, from the slums in Johannesburg. But however, what I found interesting about Trump is that well, I mean, the whole performativity, the theatricality of his attempt to impose this reality on this representative from South Africa. Now, of course, in the context where they are funding a genocide of the Palestinian people, in the context where, you know, I mean, they're at war with so many people, and they choose this kind of moment, you know, to say, oh no, that's a genocide, you know, that's one. But then what's interesting about that is that it mobilizes all of these aspects in a theatrical way, very theatrical. You know, like the way that he's like, oh, you know, turn the lights down, and then, you know, he has the whole thing, the edit, the cut, he's got it prepared, like he knows exactly what he's going to do. And this poor fucking guy, this representative of South Africa, is just like, what the fuck, you know? But he's being very diplomatic, you know, he's being very, very gracious, very, but you know, of course, he's just like, what the fuck is happening here? You are just like shitting in my face, you know, you're shitting in my mouth. Like, I've come here to have, you know, some kind of like,
I haven't seen this
diplomatic discussion. And,
I was quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
No, it was one of the wildest things, I think. One of the
But I think
wildest things I think I've ever seen.
His response, I mean, the calm with which he responded, I found amazing. You know, like someone like white genocide in South Africa. I'm like, okay,
Yeah, no, it
this,
was.
you know, this is where we're at.
It was incredible. Now, you know, the thing is that, and that's why it'd be nice to have, you know, Kian, because, you know, he could testify to a lot of this. Is there that kind of violence happening in South Africa? Yeah, absolutely. Is it genocidal? Is it, you know, I mean, all of those things are kind of in question. However, what interested me about that moment of Trump was the theatricality. It was the way that he kind of staged this whole thing in the Oval Office. You know, he staged this whole scene basically that was very obviously pre-prepared. Which, you know, Hattrick, I'm sure you'll watch it once we've finished talking. But it's like it is cinematic, and it's also kind of funny, like, you know, in the way that him presenting his, like, you know, boards of tariffs. You know, well, Europe, they're really tough, you know, but we're gonna do half. We're gonna make a deal. It's gonna be great. And anyway, so just what really interested me about this kind of that moment in the contemporary was how much it marries to this notion of like enforcing reality. And then there was the link that, like I said, to love and, you know, like conflict in relationships as a kind of enforcement of, you know, one reality against another. You know, it doesn't matter which one's correct or incorrect, or, you know, even if there is such a thing as being correct or incorrect. But that's like a big problem in love. And then the last thing I wanted to say was about Dupré, the patient and the clinical file. And what I found really fascinating about Dupré, and it's something that I wrote about in my thesis, it's in a chapter called The Body Without a Handle, is that what is the kind of like target or object of psychiatric power? Now, Foucault goes on later in this lecture, in lecture 7, he goes on later to bring up this thing of avowal, of confession. Now, of course, this is what will occupy him for his later work, for the rest of his life, you know. However, like in this moment, and that's the difficult position that I always find myself in at this first stage of the seminars, is because, you know, I have the answers, but like I can't just give them out because that undermine the whole point of the fucking thing. But however, you know, Foucault's already talking about avowal and confession in 73. He's already talking about these themes. Now, when we look at the depiction of Depré, what I find really interesting is that just like the young man I described in my thesis, I think I called him Arjit. It wasn't really his name, but, you know, anonymity, anthropology, blah, blah, blah. He just didn't really do anything wrong, this guy. And so, but whilst at the same time doing nothing wrong, he posed a kind of block or refusal, or, you know, like object of difficulty for the educational system. So they had to get rid of him in some way. And so I kind of wrote about how they got rid of him. But what's interesting about Depré and the depiction of Depré, and I think, you know, this could lead into like a broader discussion of the way in which like Foucault chooses examples and what they mean in the context of his oeuvre. What's really interesting about Depré is all of the things upon which psychiatric power would latch, he lacks. So his countenance, right? You know, he has like he's blank, he's unreadable. He has a face that he doesn't symbol or signify. When he speaks, he claims he's, you know, Napoleon. He claims he's all these great people. And that, the very interesting point about this is the money and his refusal and denial of money, you know, and the existence of money. Now, of course, you know, we know that, you know, like Depré is right. You know, money is an illusion. It's a fantasy. It's a fabrication. But what is essential to the psychoanalytic relationship? Well, it's money. You know, with my psychoanalyst, we've had many discussions about, you know, for example, if I can't afford to pay, you know, how can I pay him? And, you know, can I do work for, I mean, I can't really speak about it, but, you know, can I do work for him? You know, can I help him with teaching certain people that he's involved with or networks? So, you know, but in some way there has to be payment. There has to be an exchange. But what does he do? Well, he completely refuses money. He completely, you know, his countenance, his, and so to me, like Depré is it's a really interesting example. And then because, well, what speaks, you know, or what does, what is legible about Depré? Well, they are precisely these other things that are socially legible and that have meaning and significance. So specifically, you know, he's fat, he's short, he's stout. You know, so all of these things kind of like signal or symbolize certain like social foibles or failings, you know. By being fat, one is able to do something else. By being this, by da-da-da. But however, the most essential aspects of himself that psychiatric power tries to latch onto, he lacks. You know, he lacks regularity and consistency in thought. He lacks a readable countenance. He lacks like a sense. Anyway, so I just thought that was interesting. And then I thought that these two lectures were really good because they almost like, and this is, by the way, this is generally how Foucault's lectures go. They begin with a kind of idea, they get like a bit messy and rough, and then they begin to whoop and get fucking exciting towards the end. And then, like, you know, he makes some kind of closure. But yeah. So, you know, I've spoke about, you know, a lot of different things. And,
yeah, all right, bloody hell. Okay, all right. Well, give me a second because I feel like I've just been throwing like 4 balls at once. So I'm in danger of dropping all of them. So first of all, I'm going to kick that one into the distance that you just mentioned, the body with a handle, because I think like I've got something to say about that, but it doesn't fit in here. Yeah, I'm going to go to that. Like just an aside, like I think it's like kind of hilarious. This you know, the Donald Trump with this oversized like tariff board, because I think it's almost like this kind of slapstick version of what we're talking about. Like it's almost as if he's you know, one of these hosts on a Saturday morning game show for kids, you know, and he's got like one of these like, you know, some sort of inflatable hammer or something, you know, or an inflatable donkey, or you know, and of course those Saturday morning kids programs are, like, in Baudrillard's sense, kind of pornographic, obscene. You know, everything is really large, like the facial gestures, for example, of the presenters always have to be kind of exaggerated and like explicit to the point of hyperbole. So if they're happy, they're like elated or euphoric, you know, and if they're sad, they'll do like you know, a sad clown face, you know. So there's a sense in which, like, you know, the obscene is a kind of, you know, absolute legibility, you know, with no remainder, without enigma, without mystery, without intrigue. And and Donald Trump is kind of pornographic and obscene in the same way. And I think, like, in relation to this idea of, you know, when to impose reality, you need a kind of dramaturgy, you know, a theatricality. There needs to be a sort of mise en scène, but and of course, like, you're talking about how Donald Trump orchestrates that by changing the setting, dimming the lights, you know, pushing his chair really close to someone so that they can feel kind of like trapped and claustrophobic, you know, possibly a bit like that guy whose, you know, appearance on the Diary of a CEO we both watched, you know, the guy who's an expert at sort of like, he used to work for the CIA or something, or the FBI, you know, and he's an expert at kind of like reading like body language and gesture. And he would say that, you know, he would always, you know, have it so that his chair was like much higher than the chair of the person he'd be talking to. And he'd often put them in awkward positions, like he'd put them on a couch, for example, that was slightly too lumpy and uncomfortable. So they kept having to shift, you know, because, like, you know, shifting puts the body in this state of like fragility, you know, it sets off certain hormones that are to do with like survivalism, you know, and I think, but like awkwardness does that, like, it makes you sweat, you know, and it makes you fidget and things like that. And I think all that kind of stuff, all those little like power plays, and I mean, there are loads of them. Like, you think about the playground power play of like shaking someone's hand in a certain way. So you've got like, there are loads of like moves and counter moves. So you've got like the hard handshake, and then you've got like, if you've got a hard handshake, you can counter that by putting your hand on someone's elbow. You know? And if someone puts his hand on your elbow, you can counter that by putting your hand on their shoulder, you know. And if someone does that, you can give them a little slap around the, you know, the cheeks, you know. And so there's this idea that the domination of a certain person is imposed through almost like a kind of like dance, really. There's something kind of like balletic and strangely like, you know, like homoerotically intimate about these like handshakes, touching people, and, you know, and then there'd be like, we'd have like theories in the playground, like, no, but if you stroke his cheek, that's an even better power play. You can't come back from that one, you know, especially if he blushes, you know.
The stroke of no return.
There you go. Yeah. What was I going to say? Oh yeah. Yeah. So, and I just like to mention some basic parallels. Like, you've got, Foucault actually uses that imagery of like height difference, you know. So first of all, in the Herculean doctor, who, as Luke was saying before, is kind of like muscular, has a kind of like splendor of body, you know. His teeth gleam. He looks like he's in the kind of like prime of health, you know. He kind of struts in with a, you know, retinue of like a, you know, groupies, like, you know, behind him, you know, in the form of his students and weird secretaries making notes and everything. It's a kind of like, it's a regal, yeah, it's a kind of like, it's a regal procession. And Foucault actually uses this image of the slope, you know. The imbalanced power takes like the visual form of a slope with the, you know, the patient at the bottom and the doctor at the top. And so yeah, so all that's in there. The only other thing that I'd add is this, that like, as we all know, reality is often invoked as a kind of an alibi for control. You know? It's like morality is disguised as reality. You can see that everywhere in parenting, schools, in police work, and so on. Often you come up against the claim that something is real. Like, if you don't work hard, you're not going to succeed. You know, or, you know, you got to learn to listen, or you're going to get nowhere in life. You know, and there's a sense in which, like, you know, there's a, how should I put it? Like, in schools, okay, there's this idea, okay, if you don't get a good mark in your exams, you know, you're not going to get into sixth form, and if you don't get into sixth form, you're not going to get a good job, you know. So I'm the kind of like gatekeeper here, you know. I'm the one who knows that reality, and you're the one who has to kind of submit yourself to it. okay, and I will give you the kind of clues, techniques, and you know, a methodology for being able to surrender yourself, for being able to submit yourself, you know, to this, like, to this reality. But if you refuse, it will be your failure, you know. And I was just wondering about, like, what is the status of that reality then? Yeah, because it seems to me to be a kind of fraudulent imposition in most cases. Like, you know, you can, who actually, another example would be, like, you know, the fight that's interrupted in the playground that I mentioned another week. Yeah, there's a sense in which, oh shit, if we don't intervene now, something terrible is going to happen. You know, there could be blood. You know, you never know. Like, so he gets pushed, he bangs his head, and he's concussed. He's in a wheelchair for life. You know, these things happen. There's a claim about reality. But fundamentally, like, as Luke was saying in a conversation I had with him the other day, kids have a kind of sixth sense for when they've gone too far. You know, they hold back. Like Oscar, for example, my oldest kid, is he would never hit Victor full on in the face as hard as he could. You know, he's just never going to do that. You know, he doesn't want to damage his brother, no matter how annoyed he gets. You know, and he has the ability to be able to control himself, to be able to calm himself down, so that he doesn't commit some, like, you know, horrendous deed. The fight doesn't lead to catastrophe. You know, the fight is this attempt to resolve something that is not in danger of arriving, you know, as quickly as parents or teachers predict at this moment of catastrophe. Yeah. So shit. What was I wanted to say something. All right, so yeah, so in some way, a kind of like fake or fraudulent reality is claimed to be the real one. Now, how do the teachers get away with this? Well, it seems to me that the asylum and schools and prisons, for example, what they have is they exist as a kind of parallel reality, you know. So within and it's a kind of like sanitized space, a sort of whitewashed space, in which, in a weird way, you can begin from scratch. You know, you can kind of like create a mini sort of utopia, a society, a pure society from its very beginnings upwards. So you can actually, although you're claiming that, okay, I'm only punishing you, yeah, so that you understand the truth. This punishment is a kind of rehearsal for the future, okay? It will help you to rehearse for the future. But then, in the context of the school, what the punishment is actually doing is it's creating the reality that it is imposing. Okay, and I think we see that, like, in various other instances in the asylum scenario as well. You have this idea that money is important. Okay, well, why is money important? You know, as Luke was saying, Dupré rejects money completely. You know, he says it's all counterfeit and forgery. So why would I have anything to do with it? You know, I'm Napoleon. I know money when I see it. You know, this is not the real thing. So what you need to do is to attach him to this system of money. So you produce in him a kind of deprivation, a deficit. You know, you starve him, for example, so that he doesn't. You know, and then you say you choreograph it again. You know, you organize this reality in the form of dramaturgy and mise en scène, so that one of the nurses secretly goes to Dupré and she says, look, you know, what I could do, you know, I'll be going out on a limb here, but what I could do is I can steal some stuff from the canteen for you, but you're going to have to make it worth my while. And Dupré says, well, I haven't got any money, you know. And then she says, oh, well, sorry, well, I can't help you then. And so the next day he's going in, he's like, well, how much money am I going to get for doing this work, you know? Thinking to himself, well, I need this to pay the nurse so she can get me more food, you know. So he's been attached to this system of money, but that reality has actually just been constituted by the asylum scenario, by the psychiatric situation. So, you know, I just want to end this by saying there's the status of this reality seems to be radically uncertain. Okay, it's not as if Luret like waits for Dupré to bump into reality. You know, there's a difference between waiting for someone to bump into reality. Like, where the fuck is reality? You know, we'll know it when we bump into it. Oh shit, I thought it was much closer to us. You know, I thought we couldn't actually go that far, but it turns out we can go all the way down here. You know, before we bump into this reality. Right? You know, it's a fundamental part of growing up to be able to distinguish between laws that can be bent and broken and laws that can't. You know, and that's where, like, you know, Luke's idea of like the invoked in this discussion of the reality of love, that's where that's distinguished from these fraudulent realities, which were only temporarily instituted, and the kind of, I don't want to be like too mad about this because I don't really agree with this, but they survive as a collective delusion, or they survive. Let's just say they survive by consensus, you know, in the form of you can't do this, you can't do that. No, that's not allowed. No, if you do that, then this bad thing will happen. Blah blah blah. Yeah, no, I'm not going to comment on the other stuff right now because I'd like to see what people think of that, you know, especially Jakob.
No, sick. I mean, to me, this text is like a fucking woof. It's like a crazy one. This text.
Yeah, isn't it?
So good and so many things to say. I feel
you could set up your house in any of the paragraphs, you know.
Yeah, no, for real, it's crazy.
Just be
I think
gardening there for the rest of your life.
No, especially 6 or 7. I feel 8 is more like Luke, you were saying, more of some kind of sum up of these things where he goes on to these 4 tentacles of reality, and direction, of course, is also, speaking of mise en scène and directing as Trump is doing. I mean, the psychiatrist as the director.
That's nice. Yeah, that's
I
good,
just couldn't help myself of them being a director of films to reflect a little bit on it. But
or think about the other word, réalisateur. You know, the one who realizes.
Yeah. What in Danish it's instructor.
Okay.
Director in English, réalisateur, instructor. It's interesting. Well, anyway, first, just some quick remarks on both your kind of spiels. Don Quixote. I mean, I'm just thinking of Gerard. I mean, he has this long idea about Cervantes, right, and mimetic desire and the triangle of desire in all these like. In modern novels, but he also works with Cervantes, right? Where he says, where for him there is this triangular composition, right? Where I can't remember if it's Don Quixote or who it is, but no, I'm pretty sure it's Don Quixote. But he sets up this frame where he says, you know, I mean, Don Quixote looks to another knight and thinks, oh, I want to be like that knight, and then that knight supposedly wants the lady or whoever the fuck it is, right? And this is Gerard becomes obsessed with this and with the kind of mimetic nature of the knights and all this stuff, and also the kind of almost I can't remember if he goes into masochism with knights, but there is a certain masochism with the knights, right? Because they dream of the impossible, the maiden, the fair lady that they can never have, and then they go on these crazy journeys that, I mean, they kill themselves, right? So just a point on that, and then. The kids thing with you, Patrick. I mean, I was just with this hitting thing. I was really curious about that. I thought it was a great example. But it's also
what thing?
Yeah, with your kid, was it Victor that wouldn't hit
Oscar,
his brother? Oscar. Yeah. But my point here, I think, which is interesting. I mean, with psychiatry, and maybe we can return to that in a bit, is that. Well, okay, but if pushed, you know, if normality and if regularity and all these things, you know, if the family is kind of decomposing, you know, order doesn't really apply, someone is threatening, you know, like if we push all the buttons, in a sense, we push all the levers, and we really see, you know, will he punch him? If we really push him, you know, would he punch him really fucking hard if he had to? You know, but this is the point where reality then starts to break down, right? I mean, we can go into acid trips and whatnot later on, but I mean, for reality to break down in the psychiatric case, there needs to be immense pressure, right? And or for the person, relative to the person, immense pressure. And I just thought that's a kind of thing there, but. Oh fucking! I mean, I don't know where to start. Really, I'm really, of course, occupied with this kind of autobiography shit that he goes into and starts talking about, and which he has at this point isn't solving. He says, or he says something about that he doesn't really understand how this kind of retelling of one's own story. Well, I can read it. I think it's really beautiful. He says, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but I'm quite unable to resolve at present how, in fact, the account of one's own life came to be an essential component with several uses in all those processes that take charge of individuals and disciplining them. why did telling one's life story become an episode within the disciplinary enterprise? How was recounting one's past? How was the memory of childhood able to find a place within this? I don't really know. I mean, super interesting, I feel. And I don't know if I'm just going to start there. To be honest, there's too much. But this, I'm like, surely we will return to this, right? I mean, confessions, all this kind of stuff, right? Because I'm like, bro, what the fuck? I mean, I'm sorry, but it does seem very obvious, you know? So it's interesting that he asks this thing because also, yeah, now maybe we can come back to that. But Freud's basic idea of binding, right, that he develops is that energy is bound into objects, ideas, and ultimately, I think, stories, right? So story becomes the most kind of, or this is now that's just my take at least, but I mean, a story and autobiography is a powerful way of binding all this energy, right? And Freud's idea of unbinding is where you want to, you know, I mean, basically disappear, right, or die. This is what unbinding means, when you know, when the ego shatters, when it cannot recollect, it cannot collect itself, it just goes into this, right? And I think there is a long history in psychoanalysis of asserting, especially in the case of psychosis. Christopher Bollas has this kind of argument about treating psychosis and schizophrenia with psychoanalysis, which a lot of people says, no, you know, this is hopeless. We don't treat these diagnoses with psychoanalysis. But his point there is, you have to find the moment in history. You have to make them retell their history, and this is how they find back to their roots, in a sense, or this is how they ground themselves. So that's just that. But there's so many things. But
I also think that, like, how should I put it? Freud. One of the things that Freud does do, which makes him kind of like in excess of his own theories, is that he accepts, like, how should I put it? The ego is not even the right word, but subjectivity as a kind of plethora, as a plenitude. So he will literally take anything for evidence. You know, he's just like, yeah, talk, you know, and he will take all of that and he'll kind of like traverse and survey the entire, almost like globe of speech, you know, the whole cosmos of speech. Whereas I feel like that's precisely not what's happening here. I was saying a few like things like this to Luke earlier, you know, that there's no interest in this person's past. There's no interest in you know, Dupre's experience. What's wanted is a kind of like an absolute minimal participation. So one, you accept, for example, the implantation of like what he calls the foreign will. So you kind of like surrender yourself to the will of the doctor. So you accept that like hierarchy and balance. Secondly, is you accept the statutory identity as your own. So in fact, the biography that Luray wants, and that's like, you know, necessitated by this sort of like disciplinary system, is simply the one that states certain facts about you. When you were born, who your parents were, what their jobs were, you know, your education history, it's almost like a CV. Yeah. So it's a kind of a willingness to accept absolute identification with your CV, with the profile that's kept on you.
But it's also, I mean, this is where he goes also to say that he has to write everything he can remember down, right? This is the task he's given Dupre in that at least Luray accounts. That he's told
but
to...
I think that's different. I think that's related to something else. I think that's a writing exercise that doesn't actually link to this idea of him in, because look, what does he want? He wants.
I think they're part of the same mechanism, and then they can be exploited in different ways.
Yeah,
yeah.
Because I think you're right. They're part of the same mechanism, but I think this idea of biography, like the word biography, at this point anyway, which is interesting because it's different in Freud, like it's different in psychoanalysis. So I think there is some way of seeing like Foucault wanting to put this in a history that leads to psychoanalysis, but then psychoanalysis is in some way excessive in respect of this history. So sort of some parts of psychoanalysis escape this like Foucauldian genealogy, I think, like, you know.
Right.
So
but
I just think that here there's like, sorry, I'll let you talk to me just to make the point. Like, it reminds me of just this moment where, like in Luke's thesis, for example, where he talks about the panic and desperation around getting a kid to write their name on the exam, you know. Well, why? Because then they're not a refusenik, you know. They haven't like, you know, they don't represent this kind of like absolute negativity with respect to the system. That somehow the system has been able to invade their subjectivity, but all that's required is like them signing off. I was here, you know,
Yeah.
or it's like the confession, you know, I will write the confession for you. You know, the police officer will write the confession for you. All you need to do is sign it. You know, we just need your signature. So it's,
Yeah.
again, the absolute minimum of participation is required. Or you get like, you know, the famous trial of King Charles I, before he was executed. You get this panic because he refuses to accept the trial, like his trial for treason. And all these, like, I forget what the committee is called, but all the members of the committee who will be like, you know, the parliamentary power that kind of like, you know, that succeeds the monarchical rule that's now been abolished. It's been days and days trying to trick him and tease him and entice him into just participating, you know, accepting that he's in a trial, but he refuses to recognize that this is law, you know, that this is, and it obviously at the end he's executed anyway, but you know that this causes them a kind of like panic and tantrum and despair, and I just see something like that at work. I know what you're saying, and I do agree with you, but I just feel that there's, like, it's all about statutory identity. That's repeated again and again. Why is that repeated? What's the meaning of statutory identity? Well, it relates to law, you know, and it relates to this idea of recognizing that I'm the person to whom certain things happened. I was in a certain location at a certain time, you know. I was born to a certain number of parents. I can be identified. And then that other lady, the lady who escapes the cure, the lady who's like invulnerable to the cure, she's the one who refuses even that absolute minimum of like participation. She doesn't even allow herself to be addressed under her own name. She is the person of myself. She stands beside herself, and the place that she should be occupying is the kind of gap in nature, you know. She's a bystander to her own existence. She is not like a terminus or coincidental to herself, and that is why she escapes the disciplinary control. All that Dupre does is say, yeah, okay, fine, we are in Paris, you know, like, you know, and then it's like, yes, got him, you know. Why does that moment there produce elation, euphoria, you know? Anyway, that's like, maybe I can find like the little bit I'm talking about, but
No, but just to we can continue a bit on this, but because what I'm hearing you say is the statutory thing, right? But then there is this thing that they create this canonized version, right? This is how I remember the text, that there is this moment where Lore, he kind of, you know, he has these bits of information, and that comes back also to the statue of the doctor, right? That the doctor should be able to kind of know so much about the patient that the patient kind of is like, what the fuck? How do you know all these things, you know? But then still, that obviously is a kind of reduction, and you just put him. I mean, the doctor doesn't care about if Dupre likes rose or blue. I don't know, you know, like irrelevant shit, right? But might be, in a sense, psychologically relevant for Dupre. But I guess I just see them as this whole kind of language autobiography as one big package. But then what I guess Foucault stresses is this sense that it's being like pinned and kind of manipulated and what you call shrunk in such a way that you can kind of dominate people by relating them to a very fixed autobiography or a very fixed relationship to language or all these kind of things, right? Well,
yeah, okay, all right. Well, I still disagree, but
yeah, okay,
a little bit, like, you know, but I'll come back later. Yeah, go on.
Okay, so whilst Patrick works out how to conjure his disagreement into
well, I could do it now if you like.
something legible.
No, but let's move on.
I'd just say that there were a lot of interesting things, and actually it's really nice to be like having to fucking write notes about, you know, what you both say, and I think it's a real testament to what we're doing and the extent to which, you know, these lectures are just so excessive in kind of respect of themselves, and I think what's important about that is that goes back to the pedagogic kind of like purpose of what we're trying to do here, which is like just fucking read Foucault, you know, because he's well, I always used to say when I first really understood him, I was like, you know, Foucault's the depth. You have to wade about in him. You know, he isn't a surface. But some interesting things that Jakob said. So they connect to kind of like all sorts of fundamental principles that I have, for example, in the respect of creativity in any form. So I always say that if you're not adding to the conversation, so that there is this notion in French thought, at least, it's formalized in Maurice Blanchot, and it's called l'entretien enfant, the infinite conversation. And unless you're like participating in that, well, shut the fuck up and teach people who, just be a teacher and be happy about it. Be a conveyor. Be a traduire. And Nietzsche said something. He said that for some books we could burn the rest of literature. And it was funny that you brought up the fair ladies and the knights, and it was specifically this thing in which where you talked about the demand for the impossible. Right? Now I found that really interesting because the other book that I mentioned by Stendhal, Le Chartreuse de Parme, or the Charterhouse of Parma. Well, what's the story there? So how does he? And so this is what kind of how this Nietzschean thing of you could just eliminate all the books, all the discourse between fucking Cervantes and Stendhal, and you could just read those two books. So you have Cervantes' like intervention into culture in the form of Don Quixote, and then or Don Quixote or Don Quixote or whatever. And then you have a secondary intervention by Stendhal. And what's the intervention that Stendhal makes? Well, it's precisely, it's hilarious. I mean, it's such a beautiful book. It's a hilarious parody. Now, it takes similar dimensions of, or the objects are kind of similar to the objects that Cervantes chooses, so like chivalry and courtly love. And so what is the story in the Charterhouse of Parma? Well, it's this guy, and basically he he always wants, the maiden, the princess, and he goes through kind of like 4, 5, 6 kind of like phases of this, and he never gets the girl. He never gets the girl. And so like what's quite interesting there is this dimension of impossibility and how it shifts planes. Because what really should be impossible is that, okay, so he's trapped in this garret and he's never going to get out, and And of course there is, a beautiful lady, a maiden, and she's in like a tower that's like opposite, and he can see her and she falls in love with him, and then there's some kind of like, incredible plan hatched for his escape, which always works. It's kind of like a James Bond or Jason Bourne kind of figure, right? This guy in the Charterhouse of Parma. Now, what's funny is that the impossible, it always happens for him, right? The woman falls in love with him, he escapes, but he never gets the woman. And then so that there's this kind of like dimensional displacement of impossibility that I think is really, really fucking fascinating and brilliant. Like to read that novel, to read those stories about, again, it's using the same kind of like content of Cervantes, in terms of chivalry, courtly love, and this whole bollocks tradition of knights and all this kind of stuff. But he's like intervening in that, and he's doing it in this way in which, he kind of like shifts the dimension of impossibility. So, so the impossibility that would usually govern like these kind of stories, if you think of it even in a cinematic register, right, would be the impossibility of getting the girl. In the sense of like her falling in love with you, or the impossibility of the escape, but he gets all of those things. But then what is impossible is that it sounds like I'm contradicting myself, but I'm not. What is impossible is that he never gets the girl. So he wins her affection, he wins her love, he creates these like dastardly plans, he escapes, but man never gets laid. And that is like the whole book is the succession of times, when he goes to like this castle in Germany or that castle in Austria, and the woman falls in love with him, and he has to have a dastardly scheme to get out. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting that you kind of mentioned this notion of I wrote down like Knights of the Impossible, and I just thought it was interesting to like bring that to bear upon a certain kind of like important moment in culture where Stendhal intervenes into something that Cervantes has already intervened in, and he does so to try and affect or like, operate some kind of change or transformation. And then I thought that your interest in autobiography, and well, again, I'm in this difficult situation, and of course, like I've got like on my fucking shelf there, Foucault and a Politics of Confession in Education. I have his Laurent lectures. I have, he goes in a big way into confession and the politics of confession, and returning to this work and like reading it again, which again, like, it's just, that's the beauty of it, right? It's its absolute limit point of excessiveness and brilliance. But returning to it, I now see so many things that are going to develop later on in this thought. So many things that like actually they appear in a way that, when I first read them, I was like, or the first like 2 times I read them, because I've read all of Foucault's works twice. The first 2 times, I didn't pick up on so many of these things. Like for example, the way that he begins talking about the confession in the 73, 74 lectures. I didn't pick up on the already beginning and burgeoning relationship with Baudrillard. When he talks about like the kind of nervous fibers of the brain, when he talks about the hyperreal. Well, he doesn't talk about the hyperreal, but he invokes this kind of like notion of reality, and then a notion of reality that is more real than the real. So I found that kind of interesting. I found those 2 things especially. So Jakob, when you talked about the fair ladies and the knights of the impossible, it just immediately conjured in me Stendhal and the Chartreuse de Parme, and Cervantes, which I kind of like talked about before, but on a different kind of plane. But then it links to kind of what we're trying to do in the Visible Committee and in art. Like we want to intervene in the world, we want to intervene in culture. And we have all these questions that kind of surround us about, okay, well, what's meaningful and what's not, and so I thought that was really interesting, and I thought that you're kind of like bringing out the notion of autobiography, because it will, as we will see and learn, go on to play such a huge role in his later work. I thought that was a really interesting thing that you picked up on as well.
Oh, it is that's nice. Like I was just thinking there, like, what is the Knight's Quest? Well, what's the point in this trial and ordeal? Well, you said it's done like a kind of like either at the behest or in order to impress a lady, but impress her with what? Well, with a kind of like proof of one's manhood, where manhood then becomes kind of like a sovereign concept. It means like it's a form of like illustrious being, like for example, when Napoleon was hosting Goethe, and halfway through Goethe's first speech, he just turned around to the other members of his entourage and says, "Voila, un homme," as if like perhaps you've never seen one before, or like Diogenes, going around in the daytime with his lantern, and someone comes up to him and he says, "Well, what are you doing, Diogenes, going around in the daytime with your lantern?" And he says, "Well, I'm looking for a man. What are you doing?" And so so I think and what just kind of like link that to something that Luke's idea of the body without a handle, and my response earlier was like, well, actually Luray is kind of like dexterous and virtuosic in that respect. He has this talent of seeing handles where like no one else would see them, and I talked about it. It's almost like the way in which certain plastic surgeons will be able to clip off a bit of your thigh, flesh from your thigh, and use it to sculpt an ear and then put it on. He can kind of like seed the body with things that would grow then into handles. And I thought, well, what is like one of the major handles that he finds in Dupré early on, and it definitely has to do with this idea of manhood. Dupré thinks he's the only man that exists. He thinks he's a member of this halcyon, glorious halcyon race, or in fact he's like the best, like he's a member of the highest tier of this halcyon race. He thinks that he has quite extraordinary, unparalleled sexual powers, and he also thinks that everyone's a woman except from him. So there's like
so good.
And so what Luray does, this sort of like devious, evil genius, witch doctor that he is, like he hacks his concept of madness, and he kind of colonizes it. He sets up a sort of outpost within the psyche, and like the kind of like the Empire in Star Wars. His landing spot is the concept of madness, of manhood, yeah. And like all of his things are about that. So you got the one where he spikes his dinner with a certain kind of laxative, and then the next morning says, oh well, the only man apparently the only man in this asylum is so scared of the dark that he gets the shits all night. He's on the runs all night or whatever it is, and so I think, like, well, what's the point in this? Well, to me it seems like a kind of, well, like the Puritans went to war on idolatry. This is one of their big like criticisms of the Catholic Church, and obviously there was loads of justification for it. The enormous expense of like a Catholic, mass ceremony. The kind of like luxurious clothes and robes and all like the kind of like regalia and extravagance of popes and priests and bishops and so on. But nonetheless, they went kind of like psycho with it, and I think there was one time that Christmas puddings were made illegal, because they were they were examples of idolatry. You know what Christmas pudding is? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and so what you see here, weirdly, from the position of the head psychiatrist, is a kind of like iconoclasm from above, So iconoclasm in that technical sense is like the knocking down of icons, So the icon in his head is this icon of manhood, and it reminded me. And I think I've seen this like tactical maneuver in a whole variety of different places. Like, well, we got it in the thing that I spoke about last week, Lady Macbeth. Macbeth says, "I dare do all that may become a man," and then what she does, she tries to infiltrate, go incognito into his concept of manhood and kind of like muddle it up, spike it. She says, "Well, when you durst do it, then what beast was it then that broke this enterprise to me?" Muddling his idea of the distinction between a man and a beast, and it goes on and on throughout the play, until at one point, a little bit later on, she mocks him again when he sees the ghost of Banquo. And I don't know, but I wonder whether this is like one of the earliest uses of the word unmanned. Like, can you hear that word, Jakob? Unmanned.
In what? Is it in the text?
Yeah, so it's my idea of what Luret is doing to Dupré. He wants to unman him. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now the literal, like, kind of like etymological meaning is to strip him of manhood. Like, it'll be the equivalent of like Lady Macbeth saying, "Unsex me here," take away my sexuality. But in English, it's a word. It's an actual word in English that's accrued another kind of significance, a whole range of other connotations. For example, if you've got like a stall at the fun fair, who's manning that stall? Who's looking after it? Who's taking care of it? Who's sitting there in front of it and running it? Who's directing this thing?
Yeah.
So for the stall to be unmanned, is it for it not to be looked after, not for it to be taken care of? And I thought of all, and to unman someone is like, shit. Like, how the fuck do I explain that? Like, to sort of like totally disarm them, like to unman them is to take, almost not to take away their senses quite, but it has that, to discombobulate them, to kind of like to put them in a state of panic, to take away their ability to look after themselves, to take care of themselves. And you can think about, like, maybe there is some link between the English word man and the French word main. If you think about all these, the idea of the hand is the thing that holds tools, that kind of like imposes its order on nature, that manipulates, that maneuvers. There must be some sort of etymological link between those two things. So, what did I want to say? Yeah, so that seems to be like his kind of like guiding project, to unman him, which is to say to take away his concept, his like inflated concept of manhood, the idolatry that he has towards manhood, even if he substitutes himself in the position of the idol. And the second, so one way is he does that is dismantling, but then there's another moment where he does something really weird. This is like Trumpian almost, like a slapstick version of Trump. What he tries to do is to like put on, his own, to like become Dupré's ideal man, okay, and that to put on the skin of his ideal man, to step into that place, the unoccupied place of his iconic version of manhood. And you see that in the time where he's like, he's saying to Dupré, you know, am I a woman then? You know, and Dupré's like, yeah, you're a woman, you know. And he gets like the shower and puts it down his throat, and he says, is this the behavior of a woman then? And he says, well, after a few attempts, you know, Dupré was obliged to admit that it wasn't the behavior of a woman and that I was a man. So he tries, you know, if the man is being elevated in his idea to a sovereign or God, you know, then part of the psychiatric maneuver here is to step into the place of God, this vacant, you know, this vacant space of that's been left open for a God. Yeah, so there's a couple of things here. One, this idea of hacking someone's like sovereign concepts, the concepts that guide your action, the concepts that like make sense of your world as a strategic maneuver, as a disciplinary maneuver. Actually, I have a really funny story about that. I remember when I was in like year 9 or something, like year 14. Like our school was like full of like mischief, like really intelligent mischief makers, and we got to the point of just causing an absolute riot in the school. And our head of year at that time obviously thought he was real like clever clogs, you know. And he devised this assembly. He'd like called this assembly, and clearly he thought it through, like choreographed it, scripted it, gone over it with his wife, you know, in the evening and everything. And because he had this idea that for us, comedy had become a sovereign concept. We were willing to sacrifice anything for comedy, our grades, our reputation, embarrassment, you know. So he stepped in, he came up to the podium, and he was like, you know, he gave a whole speech on comedy that was meant to be an oblique commentary on our misbehavior. And he was like, well, what's the essence of comedy, boys, you know? Well, I'll tell you what the essence of comedy is. The essence of comedy is timing, you know? And then so what he did is he made this subtle maneuver where obviously when people usually say that, they mean timing internal to comedy. So like, you know, getting the punchline right, you know, organizing the story so that the kind of like climax comes at the right moment, and so on and so forth. But what he tried to do it is to kind of like transpose it onto a moral plane and be like, timing is about knowing the time and place for comedy. So he's like the kind of like naff, you know, like, you know.
I mean, that was quite good timing, you know. Yeah.
So that's the kind of like naff version of what Lady Macbeth and Lure are actually good at, you know.
Yeah. All right. Oh fuck. I mean, I don't know where to go now, but now there are a few things. And the first thing is like two, but they're quite kind of. I'm realizing how connected they are now. I mean, to me, it's really interesting that Foucault. Correct me if I'm wrong. He seems to like. He says like, oh, you know, it's kind of weird that the psychiatrists at this point, where are we? 1840, 1838, or some shit like that. He's like, well, they're not really. There's no scientific theory. They're kind of just acting upon what they believe is right. In a sense, he's saying that at this point there is no science and it's not medicine. There's no system of pathology and etc., right? But it's interesting how kind of their intuitions later than, you know, with autobiography, for example, gets kind of picked up with psychiatry or psychoanalysis. And there is this. I mean, I'm just going to read them, and the way I think he summarizes them is really like in this way that like Lure tries to fix Dupré. I mean, on man, maybe yes. I think the way I'm inclined to see it is like, well, he tries to fix him, you know, so that it's as if I'm imagining, you know, like that he's like this blob, amorphous little blob that Dupré is like, oh, Lure is like, well, fuck, I'm gonna, you know, like, it's not sticking, I'm make him stick, you know.
Have you seen that film Flubber?
Yeah, no. And he's not sticking, you know. He's like, well, madman, get away, you know, like, and woman, we can have sex later or whatever, you know, like. But I'm just going to summarize I'm going to fix us a little bit and summarize these 4 tentacles of reality that Foucault kind of draws out, right? So he says the first one is the other's will and the surplus power situated definitely on the side of the other. That's the doctor. The yoke of identity of the name and biography. That's the kind of stuff we've been circling around before. This one is interesting. Maybe we can return to this one. The non-reality of madness and the reality of the desire which constitutes the reality of madness and nullifies it as madness. And then I just took out this quote where Lure kind of is imagined to say, or I can't remember if he also writes it, but I'm not doing this in order to care for you because you are ill. I'm doing this because you are bad, because you harbor unacceptable desire. And then the fourth kind of tentacle that Foucault establishes is the reality of need, exchange, and work. Also super interesting. I keep thinking of Lacan now and all the kind of Lacanian insistence of lack and need. And well, maybe it's interesting. But okay, the thing that he comes to then, right, is like, and Foucault goes, okay, but why is it the doctor? Like, why the fuck is it that the doctor has been endowed with all this power to run the asylum when there isn't there's no medicine being practiced? It's kind of all this worked up technique and knowledge that the doctors kind of share with each other, and moral treatment or what was it called? It's called something in French, kind of this thing, right? Moral traitement or something. I don't know what it's called, but and he goes into an explanation of this, and maybe we can go into what it is that he says, and he goes into the clinic and blah blah blah, and he makes all these arguments for why it has to be the doctor, kind of. And then my question is, yeah, but science has, like, in terms of episteme and what Foucault has previously done, right? He has kind of, not maybe in the Kuhnian way, but my understanding is that Foucault might agree in the sense that medicine and natural science is at this point the episteme, right? And my question is just, why the fuck isn't he making that argument? He goes into then some kind of microphysics of power, of tactics and moves to kind of say, well, of course it's the doctor. The doctor has to be the person. It cannot just be a random administrator of asylums, which we could, there is this anecdote that he brings up where the kind of administrator is actually as clever as the psychiatrist in the end, and they learn from each other, blah, blah. But what I'm not understanding is, like, I would see the kind of fundament of why it has to be a doctor, and then there are all these other reasons, right? But a fundament is, well, it's the discipline of medicine and natural science that kind of at this point has become the popular ordering of the world. The idea, post-enlightenment, and to me it's strange that he doesn't make this argument. I'm curious to hear why you think that is. If he's kind of just at the moment in the genealogy, and he's he's speaking a different language, and he's kind of not interested in making this kind of analysis. But it does seem strange that he doesn't make that case, I think. Well, done.
I'll just go quickly because I can very directly respond to what Jakob was talking about. So the question is, why? So why is he not, like, directly making this argument or this engagement? And so there are two kind of like critical things here that remind us why it's so important to understand Foucault in the way that we do. And that's because he is always in motion. He's always in transfiguration and reconstitution. So when he says madness or the absence of an oeuvre, now there is lots of depth to that phrase that we'll get into later, especially when we discuss his argument with Derrida on the basis of Descartes. So it's in the 72, I think, Routledge edition of the History of Madness. They have his correspondence with Derrida. But the reason, kind of like genealogically and historically, why he's not engaging with these questions is because he already has. So do you know, when I've kind of like talked a lot about, Foucault always being in motion, I've advocated this loose reading. I've advocated a kind of like tentativeness, even though he seems and feels so direct. And that's just something that, because I've read him in French, of course, but my French isn't great, and it would just be, once I finish Patrick, as a small question, is whether that kind of like directness and stricture like comes through in the French in the same way that it does in the English. I know we've talked about one thing that he says, un petit peu sophistiqué, for example, right, which is very kind of like life in the way that I was talking about. But the answer to your question, Jakob, is quite simply that he's already answered that question in Les mots et les choses. Now, there were many critiques made, correct, strong, powerful critiques made of Les mots and les choses, which is where he kind of, like absolutely goes at and attacks precisely the kind of like scientific paradigm that you mentioned. And he comes up with this notion of episteme, right? Because like, episteme is a Foucauldian notion. Like, it's a bit like discourse. It kind of existed in a way before he did, but it doesn't exist without him in a very important way. Like paradigm does, like paradigm, but episteme is very, very Foucauldian. So he's already gone to war with science. He's already had that battle. And then he's come out of Les mots et les choses. And if you think this is this is 73, so Les mots et les choses was 67 or 68. So this is like 5 years of him trying to work out how to overcome the criticisms that are made of him, that are, bang on, and to reconstitute himself. Because I think that it's in a very real sense when he talks about madness or the absence of an oeuvre. I think it's a very real sense in which he is in, like a world, right? A certain kind of like normativity. Now, imagine being Foucault, and imagine going to a bar in Paris at that time. What would people say to him when he articulated these theories? Because remember, like, so many things that Foucault talked about were fucking like haram, forbidden, completely like, the notion that a doctor is kind of interested in money and power, and there were so many things about him that he said that were heretical. So you imagine, he goes to a bar and he just wants to have a chat, or he wants to hook up, because we all know about his sexual proclivities. I mean, I can tell that story again that I find out through Rabinov about him turning up at a hotel in full latex gimp suit. If you want to go into that biographical side of Foucault's proclivities, I have like a bit of an inside track on that. But the point is that when he says madness or the absence of an oeuvre, I think he really means it quite literally. And I think that he goes out and he talks and he speaks about these ideas that he has. But they are so heretical, they are so haram, they are so forbidden. And he has to constantly question his own sanity, right? It's almost like he has to perform. And that maybe in a certain way, it comes to something that I never like to talk about, but his like fascination and fancy with these mechanisms. And you also see it with Luret, that there is an admiration there in the way that he writes. And maybe that's a little bit because he's performing Laurentian or Lorraine, or however you would say. He's performing the operations of Lorraine on himself, in a certain sense.
The exquisite instruments.
Yeah, with well, yeah, I mean, exquisite instruments of a different kind. But we could go into that, but let's not get lost there. But anyway, I think so. So the point is that, and this is really important for understanding and thinking about Foucault, and is why. I mean, I remember when I was writing this bit of my thesis, right, and I was in this library in Oxford, and the Harvard classification system of referencing is actually really fucking good. Like, it's great because it categorizes things by like theme, subject, interest. It's not like the Dewey Decimal subject. So Foucault, all of the works by Foucault and on Foucault, there were like 2 bookshelves to my left, and I read 60 or 70% of those. So, of course, all of his works many times. And of course, many of the commentaries, just like I did with Wittgenstein. What was interesting is they're constantly trying to pin him down. And they're constantly trying to, transform him into something that we can say, okay, Foucault says this. Foucault says that. This is what Foucault had to say. They're constantly trying to pin him down to a meaning, to what is only really a moment of transformation and transfiguration in his own thought. And like I said, I think that very literally, so firstly, the direct answer to your question is that he's already had this argument with like science. and then he's had these criticisms, and then he is going through in the 73, 74 lectures this progress of transfiguration, and it specifically relates to will. And then that's quite interesting, actually, and I haven't thought about that until this very moment, but the notion of will comes up very directly in these two lectures. Now, fundamentally the critique of Les Mots et les Choses, it boils down to, you know, to put it in like a sentence and to make it simple. Well, okay, so we have all of these orders, and yeah, okay, this makes sense, and you know, I don't know if you've read it, and you know, it begins with his commentary on Las Meninas by Velázquez, and how the portrait or picture, or, you know, painting of Las Meninas by Velázquez, it exhausts the possibility of expression that are possible within what he calls the classical era. So he's already gone to war. He's already had this fight. Now he's been criticized. And rightly, because people are okay. Do you know what? Like, fucking hell, yeah. These things are governed by like paradigms, by conditions of possibility, by, you know, by structures of power. Well, in fact, no, get rid of the power, but by structures. You know, they are structured, definitely. But why? Why? And that's when he goes to Nietzsche. Now, he didn't actually read Nietzsche until quite late in his life, and so that's why he goes to Nietzsche. And then the answer is just beginning to unfold and to blossom and to bloom now. In Psychiatric Power, the answer to the why is will, the will to power. It's a fundamentally Nietzschean answer. So that's why he doesn't engage with the problem that you talk about directly, because he already has. And then he's in this game, I think, which is like I don't know. It's a game that he's kind of playing with himself, because he wants to know that he is not mad. Now, how does he constitute his sense of sanity? Well, it's through these transfigurations where his works all connect with one another. And that's what gives them their richness and vitality, but it's also what makes them kind of like disparate and strange and odd. Right? You know, because he isn't like a Schopenhauer. He's not like Hegel. He's not like Heidegger. He's not like, you know, many other thinkers who, I mean, you know, me and Patrick talk a lot about Stanley Cavell. And like how Stanley Cavell like ended, you know, his life, and trying to like reconstitute a certain like coterie of reading, which is completely against like everything that, you know, Cavell stood for in his books and in his work beforehand. And so Foucault's doing something very different. And I think it's one of the most beautiful things about him. He's constantly in this movement of self-transfiguration, of self-reconstitution. And I think in a very literal sense, he is trying to prove to himself that he is not mad. And he is not mad because his work, it has an oeuvre. You know that there is a thread, there is a continuity, there is a line, a narrative, a story, from the first works he does to the last works he does.
Speaking of autobiography, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is interesting. So what? Just to recapitulate, so there's some sense. I mean, there's some sense in that in which I think that Jacob's question still hangs there, but I'll get to that in a second. Well, just very briefly, like, you know, he talks about this idea of, you know, the obligation to have counters or tokens of knowledge. You know? So then the question would be, well, why are those tokens worth anything? You know, maybe, you know, I do actually think Luke got to the truth, but I just think that there is still, why does Foucault pose the question to himself? You know, it's particular, this is medical power. Well, what's medical power? And then he goes off on a tangent and says, well, it can't be this, you know, this, that, and the other. But it can't be this reason because, like, you know, whatever, the hospital is laid out, not in terms of, like, you know, nosographical categories, you know, or in terms of illnesses, like it is now with the cancer ward, and, you know, on your right, and then, you know, orthopedics department, and then day surgery down there. But it's actually organized on disciplinary principles. Like, here are the disobedient, and here are the more pliant and, you know, and acquiescent. Here are the people that are in punishment, you know, temporary punishment. Here are the people that are not punished. Here are the people that are kind of agitated and feverish, and here are the people that are slightly calmer. So that there's, and then he goes and reposes the question again, and, you know, that still doesn't quite get to the reason why. He says, well, it's a kind of mise en scène, you know. You know, he has this extravagant idea that it's the asylum is the sort of like psychiatrist's body, you know, as if it were a kind of womb that enclosed the patients or the inmates, or what you want to call them. And then he finally gets to this a slightly different point where he talks about tokens of knowledge. That's fascinating. I want to go back to that later, but I just want to kind of like, get to what Luke said. So in these episodes that Foucault recounts, like for example the face-off between Luret and Dupré is one of these episodes. What I think we see is a kind of like prehistory of modern science, the primal scene of modern science. Okay, almost like that's sort of the Big Bang of modern science. This primordial event in which like forces come into conflict or collision with one another, and this collision as a byproduct, as a sort of collateral effect, produces the theoretical categories of modern science. Okay, but fundamentally they are related to the tactics and maneuvers and strategies that are employed in this moment. Now, why use this language from science? Well, actually, I've got like an interesting answer to this. I'm going to read out this tiny quote and then I'm going to like interpret it. So it says, psychiatric power is a regime, but at the same time it is a struggle against madness conceived as a will in revolt, as an unbounded will, whatever nosographic analysis or description may ultimately be given of its phenomena. So what's like primitive here is this face-off between two forces. One, madness as kind of indomitable, or ungovernable will, and the other one, a sort of force of containment, okay, which is the disciplinary power. Okay, and it's precisely that game, that joust, that contest that ends up later being elaborated into a series of nosographic categories and scientific methodology and so on. But in its beginnings is not that. So here, this is the weird thing. So let me just kind of like make an aside. So there's a certain reading of this, and we've talked about like the transposability of Foucault's work. And we've actually illustrated how transposability is by talking about, okay, well, we can also think of the prison in this way, or we can also think of the school along these lines, or in fact, parenting sometimes takes this form. So I actually think that Foucault is kind of, although he is doing an analytics of disciplinary power as it's manifested in the asylum, he is also writing a kind of allegory, okay, that can be read almost as alongside like Let Perzan of Montesquieu, or Gulliver's Travels, or the New Atlantis. He's writing an allegory in which, which kind of satirizes the attempt to found a utopia. Okay,
could you just elaborate on those stories, just so we're all in the same room?
Yeah. So in each of them, well, like Gulliver's Travel is probably the easiest one to get. You've got this idea that, okay, Gulliver goes to visit, a land of like really small people. Okay. And he ends up there and they kind of tie him down. All right. But when he's there, because it's an allegory, what it does is precisely in its like, it allows us to defamiliarize, to see something that we cross on an everyday basis in an unfamiliar form, so we can have a more like crystalline perception of it. And I'll give you an example of it. Gulliver is kind of like pinned down, and think about this. This is a giant, like, bigger than like 10 cathedrals, who suddenly turned up in your land. This is a wonder of the world, a miracle, a kind of like a God-sent enigma. But what is the attitude of these little, I don't know if they're called the Brobdingnagians or something anyway. What is the attitude of these little people, where it's utterly sort of like cold-heartedly pragmatic? They're like, okay, well, should we just kill him because he might pose a danger to us? He might get up and just start eating us. We don't know. Maybe he's a monster. And then like one of the scientists comes along and says, but there's problems, because if we kill him, how are we going to be able to remove his corpse? And it might kind of pollute the land and everything, and we'd all like die of diseases. Why don't we put him to work, make him useful? So they have Gulliver like trimming the trees in the kind of royal park, and he's like a guy that carries people from one side of the kingdom to the other.
I mean, if Luret could do that to Dupré,
he's become immediately integrated into this kind of like quite like one-dimensional thinking of this sort of system. Yeah. So all I'm saying is that and that's kind of transposable. It doubles up as a critique of like our society or whatever. A sort of like something that illuminates or enlightens people who are living in our side, because we're like, well, fuck, that's how we behave. Maybe we've become like deaf to miracles. Maybe we've become like immune to wonders. Maybe we are stuck in this kind of like pragmatic coldness of soul as well. Now, why do I think that? Like that this is an allegory. Well, it comes down to this term microphysics. And I was thinking about this term microphysics. Like, what the hell does this actually mean? And then it suddenly occurred to me, well, Foucault is trying to tell a story about the fundamental structure of human reality. Okay, and what's the name for that? That kind of like quest in philosophy? Well, it's metaphysics. Okay, metaphysics is the attempt to describe the fundamental structure of reality or the fundamental structure of human reality. So he's deliberately, kind of like in a kind of like playful, like like saucy way, playing on that idea of metaphysics and calling it microphysics instead. Why call it microphysics then? Well, because he believes that the fundamental structure of reality is something that grows like the Big Bang. The Big Bang is the thing that gives rise to the whole cosmos. And in some sense, we still see its after effects even now. And in that weird way, the whole cosmos is nothing more than a Big Bang. I mean, we can still see its beginning out there in distant space. And we can kind of like by calculations predict its end. So we're living in one long Big Bang. And I think that the microphysics of power is this attempt to describe the fundamental forces that end up producing social reality, whatever form that ends up taking. And for Foucault, those forces are, as I've said, I'll just go back to the beginning again on that kind of circuitous route. The madness as the will in revolt, refusal, denial, rejection, dodging, evasion, contempt, mischief, and then the will to power in Luke's terms, or the will to control, the discipline, which is a force of containment, limitation, categorization, channeling, reorganizing, slowing things down, and that is kind of like, so that's a kind of like, if you imagine what Luke said about this being, I don't know what he said, but like this being the sort of like the prehistory to modern science. What I wanted to do there is just kind of zoom in on that moment, the moment of that prehistory, the primal scene of modern science. And so why was a Nietzschean move? Because what did Nietzsche do? Nietzsche said, well, look, you think that you espouse certain Christian values like modesty and self-effacement and chastity and so on. But if you go back, if you listen to my genealogy, which is again an allegory, what you see is that the drive to adopt those as sovereign values actually comes out of, I don't know how much you know of this, Jacob, but I'm not going to fill in all the details, actually comes out of a contest of wills. An attempt, you were part of a subjugated people, and there were a kind of like, this, whatever it is in the most like kind of cartoon version of it, an Aryan sort of aristocratic race of kind of like spendthrift barons that would often, for their kind of leisure and entertainment, riot through your village, setting fire to random houses and raping the women. You had to fight back. Okay, so what you did is you told them that their kind of like their arrogance and vitality and wildness was evil. You reevaluate, you kind of like, you transformed the whole value system, and you said to them that to be good, to go to heaven, is to be like you, to be chaste and humble, and deferential and so on, So there's a kind of your values don't come through these epiphanies that you get, and these moments of revelation of the will of God. They have a historical story, and they relate to this moment of confrontation with another group that had kind of like this sort of domineering power over you. So Foucault is, again, all I'm talking about there is just that structurally Foucault's move is very similar to Nietzsche. That's why it's Nietzschean. That modern science has, or modern psychiatry here particularly, has its origins in joust, tactical face-off, particularly the desire to subjugate, tame, neutralize the will to revolt, which is not negative here, but exuberant, spontaneous, also enormously inventive. Like if you think about how inventive madness is, it's astonishingly some forms of madness are astonishingly profligate in their inventiveness. Like one of the ones that Freud imagines, where literally a guy has created his own like personal cosmology and religion. I'm gonna stop there. Yeah. So,
but,
I mean, I have like I mean, there are so many things in that. All right, so just the little things that I've noted down. So you talked about the Big Bang, and my friend Phil, Dr. Bull, who is a really interesting, brilliant guy, and he's currently sat in the how would you say that the kind of like most sophisticated antenna array that the United Kingdom has, and he's listening for whispers of the universe. And when I met him,
It's a cool
I
job.
said, it was this classic kind of, Oxford thing, or whatever. Like, I haven't been a graduate in a different context, and so there was this question that, okay, so what do you do? What you're interested in? And at that point, I just lived in the rainforest, and so I was really interested in this thing called like cosmology, right? Which is like eschatology, which is the theory of like life, death, the universe, and everything. And he said to me, he was like, I'm a cosmologist. Now that, if you think of the kind of social prestige and weight accorded to being an astrophysicist, right, which like a lot of people claim without actually, having the means or rights to, that's what his doctorate was in. It's kind of technical at Oxford because you always graduate with a doctorate in philosophy. Like, it doesn't matter. You graduate with a doctorate in philosophy and the title of your thesis. You don't graduate with like a doctorate in something. I don't know if that's the case at the university. But anyway, so he said to me, he was like, and it's kind of wild in a way. I was like, so what are you working on? He was like, well, I'm working on the problem of the origins of the universe. I'm a cosmologist, right? I was like, oh, cool. How are we gonna figure out that one? And he's like, well, if I can work out the temperature inside a black hole, I can solve the problem. Now, what's interesting is you were saying, Patrick, about that we have this evidence of the Big Bang, and now one of those pieces of evidence is a thing called redshift. So what that means is that when we look at things in the telescope, the color spectrum moves because it looked like things were slowing down. Now that would make a lot of sense. However, Phil, I'm sure he is still trying to figure out the answer to the problem of the start of the universe. But what he's noticed is that rather than what he thought at first, and so what he's like generally, like if you look into like quantum and so the usual story is that like you have the Big Bang, and then well the question then being, well, what gave the energy to spark the Big Bang? Because as soon as you start talking about quantum physics, and it's all about energy. And that's what they found at CERN, right? So what they found at CERN is that the more energy that they put in bashing these particles together, the more that they break down into like further and further levels of reality. And it's like more than 40 levels of reality that they've discovered. Now, we understand like very, very basically what you might call like the second level of reality, right? Which is like classical Newtonian, atoms, neurons, As soon as it gets to quarks, like we don't have a fucking clue. And then there are what's interesting about all these levels of reality is that they are orderly, but they're orderly in a way that we can't understand. So the kind of the scientific thing is like, well, let's stop bashing these particles together, trying to find the fundamental level of reality, because we found more than 40 and we can barely explain 2. And so, but something that Phil found out recently is that the universe is not slowing down as redshift might indicate. Actually, the expansion of the universe is speeding up. So that's like a huge problem, right, in physics, because the assumption was, okay, redshift, and then, okay, so we look at these things and the universe is slowing down. And of course, this is absolutely not my area of expertise. But it's just interesting because it links to Nietzsche and the influence of like Nietzsche on Foucault, and it links to Nietzsche's idea of the infinite return, because that would be a kind of like really nice story in a way, right? So Nietzsche has this idea of like the hell of the infinite return. The true hell is the fact that you're going to have to live the same life that you've lived forever, repeatedly. Now that matches with the description in physics, kind of like before Phil posed this problem. Or what I mean, I don't know the story or the history in physics, but basically it was like you have a big bang, and then you have a big crunch. And then the idea of the Big Bang is that, well, okay, so you have this huge explosion of energy, and it sends all the particles in the universe outwards, right? Now, what happens as those particles move further and further away from each other is they become subject to a force called gravity. So the initial thought was that, well, okay, well, that's the answer, right? The energy for the Big Bang is the Big Crunch. So if you imagine it goes, and then the creates the energy for the, so then we have like Nietzsche, the infinite return, you know, I mean, like, all sorts of things, but actually it's not the case. You know, the universe is, it's accelerating in its growth. It isn't slowing down, which what people thought before. Then, you know, there was some other like interesting things that I think, like, well, I'd love to explore a bit more. So the main thing that I'd like to explore is this notion of allegory. So I kind of like in a small sense, I hinted at it before when I talked about Lure, and I talked about how there is a certain kind of like, eroticism and fascination of Foucault with Lure. You know, like when the for example, Jakob, the lady that you described, you know, me, myself, and and he describes this as like, you know, perfect and wonderful. And then there is this way in which he is kind of like performing these operations on himself in a different way, kind of substantively and materially, but formally there is a similarity to his kind of transfigurations, to the way that he breaks himself apart and reconstitutes himself. And so I thought that was. I mean, I don't know if it was what Patrick meant, but I did find that this notion of allegory really fascinating, because there is a sense in which, in a strict way, he is writing a kind of like allegory, and then that links to our like work on Kafka and parables and all sorts of things. And then just I just wanted to add two things. So just to respond to something you said a while ago, Jakob, and you know, to be the boring scholar. What Foucault and Deleuze fell out about, and because I know that, you know, you're a fan of Deleuze, like you know, I'm a fan of Deleuze, you know, like, and Guattari and you know, Mille Plateau and Capitalism and Schizophrenia. Now, the argument that developed between Foucault and Deleuze was all about desire as lack, and that is like the point in an interview, like after Deleuze and Foucault like really fell out. It was because, well, you know, Deleuze built this whole like metaphysic, this whole philosophical system on the notion of desire, and Foucault said, well, you know, I can't imagine desire but lack. And that, in the context of our conversation, I think is very interesting. And then the last thing that I was going to say was kind of like related to Patrick's account of like religion, and specifically what I was thinking of was Rome and ancient Rome. And you know how Christianity emerged. Now, we fall into a kind of fundamental trap here, and it's called functionalism. And this is why, like, when I was being trained as an anthropologist, I always remember this lesson, and I was like, "Fucking hell!" Like, this is, and I always talk about it. I probably told you about it 10 times. And the question of the lesson was, does it matter whether or not you believe in spirit possession? Right now. That's because the kind of the anchor point of anthropology is functionalism. So if you read, you know, like the greats, Baranowski, Pritchard, Douglas, Das, Abelugod, Nancy Shepherd Hughes, you know, all of them are in some sense functionalist, and that kind of comes from structuralism, and it comes from Lévi-Strauss. Now, the way in which they're functionalist is that they make explanations about things in which empirical, real, material conditions require or like necessitate certain kind of like solutions, or, you know, and so culture is often explained in that way, and to give like a kind of functionalist explanation of like Christianity. Well, where did Christianity come from? Well, it came from ancient Rome. You know, like fundamentally that was the context, the milieu, the mise en scène in which Christianity developed. Now, when you read like the original kind of like, I mean, there's all sorts of arguments about what constitutes the original Christian texts and but what fundamentally are they all about? They are all about like if you think of the Roman Empire and you think of like being a serf or a slave, or, you know, you think of being subject to that empire, well, they're going to fuck you up. You know, they are going to fuck you up. They're going to come, they're going to rape, they're going to pillage, they're going to, you know, if you do anything to contest, to challenge them. And that's the context in which Christianity emerges. And what is the core message of those, what we consider to be original texts? Well, you know, at least one of them is that there is this thing that, you know, individual will, voluntism, you know, there's intention, for example, which, you know, these things will become much more interesting as we move along with Foucault, especially about the juncture, because I think, Jakob, it was you that brought up this notion of the law. It might have been Hat-Trick in this conversation. And, you know, I was saying a few seminars ago about how, well, why does madness emerge at this particular time? Well, it emerges as the negativity of a Christian law, right? The necessity of will or intention requires madness. And so that's what we will go on to read and go on to learn. But Foucault isn't there yet. But anyway, I just thought it interesting that this, yeah. So the two things about like the Big Bang, its relationship to Nietzsche, its relationship to Foucault, its relationship to metaphysics, and then also the emergence of Christianity in the context of the Roman Empire.
Mm. Yeah, I've got a couple of things to say.
Can I go in just briefly?
Yeah,
because this ties back to what you were saying before, and it's a brief one,
right.
and I'll just see if what you're thinking about it. But I just read two sentences, right? And there's one word in here that I think really, I'm going to question, like, how does that relate to this idea of microphysics? And maybe he goes on. I don't know if Foucault goes on later in the lectures to define it even more, and if we're going to kind of go more and more into it. Does he, Luke? Or is this the kind of peak of it? Or
no. So the just to very briefly when people talk about like microaggressions, for example, you know, like in the context of activism of any kind, they talk about, you know, ordinary everyday forms in which power like kind of infiltrates, constitutes, makes certain spaces. Is a misreading of Foucault in Into Judith Butler. So basically, like he would expand on this notion of micropower and microphysics right up until 1976 or 1977, and that's when he in fact, and that's also just to relate to something that you said before, and it was something that I was wanting to speak to like a family friend about in the context of psychiatry. In fact, so he's a you know, like a prescribing psychiatric nurse and blah blah blah. And when he talks about like psychiatry, he talks about management. So the notion of like cure has vanished. You know, the notion of that. Okay, so this person has schizophrenia. Okay, so but what we do is we manage it.
Yeah, or you rehabilitate, right?
Well, I mean, it's rehabilitate, I think, is that's a perspective that we could go down and talk about, and but the for me, like the key term is management. You know, they manage the symptoms. They don't, you know, try to affect some kind of cure, you know, like Lore does, right? So they don't try and convince this person that there is this other reality that's real, and you know, what they do instead is they kind of they do practically rehabilitate them, but it's less rehabilitation and it's more habilitation, just like Foucault talks about, into a certain notion of reality. But yeah, just to directly answer what you were saying, that yes, this notion of microphysics and micropower is going to be huge in his work, all the way up to the History of Sexuality, Volume 1. And that's where we have the contemporary notion of microaggression in activist circles. It's from a misreading of his ideas that's quite pernicious. But anyway, yeah, so that's like the, you know, the simplest enough answer to your question is that yes, this idea of microphysics, of micropower, of micro dash whatever, this kind of like, you know, whatever coupling, you know, the micro is attached to, yes, it will be a bigger and bigger factor of his work right up until the History of Sexuality, Volume 1.
All right. Okay, but then maybe a question that, that we might acquaint ourselves with later on. But so he writes, this is towards the end of chapter 8, I think, or lecture 8. He says, in this, I think we can identify one of the fundamental features of what I will call the microphysics of asylum power. This game between the mad person's body and the psychiatrist's body above it, dominating it, standing over it, and at the same time absorbing it. I don't think this is the following sentence, but they're in the same paragraph. In other words, I think psychiatric power spread as a tactic for the subjection of the body in a physics of power, as power of the intensification of reality, as constitution of individuals, both as receivers and bearers of reality. Many things. I think these two sentences are fucking packed with shit. But the first one, it uses the word game, and I'm like, okay, but bro, what are we going on with the game here? Is that what he? I don't know the French translation, but the French original. But like Patrick, you were talking before, like one round before, about the kind of microphysics and I just picked up on this because I think, to me, this one. Well, I just tried to interpret, what is this microphysics, and then what are we talking about here? I mean, because to say that a game, in a sense, game is different from play. I don't know, a game between two bodies and the possible maneuvers and movements they can do, as in a chess play, or I don't know, or any other game, is interesting. I don't know. It's very reductive, and at the same time, a game is large, right?
Mm.
I mean, and I think maybe it resonates with me because I think one of the most kind of absurd and recognizable, like phrases of our era is like, well, the game is the game. You have to play the game. Don't have to hate the player, hate the game. Blah 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 blah. The game. It's as if almost in the game could fill what Foucault then kind of, I guess, commonly becomes known for, like as structures or regimes, or no, it's just a game, bro. I don't know. I'm a bit curious what you think, or it's a kind of question. What is this game?
Yeah, all right. Well, let me have a go at linking these two things together. So one form of we've been talking about cosmology and stuff, and I guess what in all philosophy, what defines human experience is it something to do with language? Yeah, either it's because language constitutes the world, in a way, for Wittgenstein, language is sort of a fundamental, almost like a fundamental fact. We find out about ourselves by finding out how we use language. You can't understand the good, in and of itself. You have to understand it through its deployment, through the way in which you can experiment with this good, or extend its meaning through further usage, and blah blah blah. And what I think is that one of the things we haven't spoken about now is how this microphysics of power takes the form of a sabotage of language. What it does is it permits certain forms of speech and then kind of outlaws, banishes, or refuses to recognize other forms of speech. And one of the major examples of this is right at the beginning. And this is actually really interesting because we've mentioned the fact that Dupré identifies himself with Napoleon, but that's not actually quite right. He identifies himself with a whole series of different people, and I actually looked up who they were, and there are a whole range of different guys. There's an astronomer, there's a priest, there's a playwright, there's a novelist, and so on. So and Foucault talks at one moment of how one of Luré's maneuvers is to correct the delirium of polymorphous naming. And I thought, well, what is this thing, polymorphous naming, and what's being done here? So two ways I thought, okay, he's been punished for a kind of linguistic perversity, or a linguistic profligacy, let's say, a kind of and almost like a sumptuous enjoyment of the superabundance of language. Secondly, he's doing what everyone does. It's another form of idolatry is not the right word. What I want, if we could imagine a really strong meaning for identification, I think Freud gives identification this kind of strong meaning, in the transference phenomena and stuff like that. Yeah. And think about the little kid, He's like, oh, sir, I'm Michael Jordan, sir. I'm Steph Curry. I'm hitting them 3-pointers. It's a normal part of growing up to identify with some like hero or icon or idol. That is, you can think about it in the book as well. Why do we read books? We read books in some way to transfigure ourselves, to become other. And the book there is a kind of like idolatry to reading. Reading is a kind of idolatry in a way. Of course, you don't want to be sucked in by a book and just like completely, have your mind hijacked by a book. That's not the point. But it does involve some act of surrender. Some moment where you leave yourself and identify, at least temporarily, with something that's other, that's strange, that's not you, in a kind of like an ecstatic experience, in the kind of literal sense of ecstatic, meaning you have to move outside oneself. So this correction of like the delirium of polymorphous naming seems to me to be a sort of particular form of, we've talked about moral orthopedics, and I think we see here a kind of linguistic orthopedics that's like really interesting. I think kind of like widespread as well. Like so that there are 3 different types that he names. One is like where is it? Yeah, so they've got the language of deference is something that's accepted. So that's a language of like courtesy, of decorum, in learning certain ways of addressing the doctors. Memorizing names, for instance. So you can accord people the kind of like title, acknowledgement, and recognition they deserve. Funny enough, never the names of the other patients, but always only the names of the employees, the staff, the personnel. The second kind of language you have that's accepted is the language of recitation. So like a language that's basically scripted, or not exactly scripted, but fundamentally it's not in your own voice. Okay, it's a recitation. They're the words of somebody else. So they don't announce a kind of dangerous subjectivity. They don't they don't unleash a dangerous subjectivity. And the third one, again, really interesting, is the language of command, imperative. And it like, how am I going to like bring these together? I'm gonna kind of leave them there with just a tiny comment that, well, the language of imperative is fundamentally the language of algorithm. Okay, and that underlies now precisely a sort of like, if you like, our modern epochal version of what counts as consciousness, which is, that consciousness is understood. Whether there are obviously some people that don't think this, there are great scientists who reject this, but if you like, the kind of like the zeitgeist's idea of consciousness is that it's computational, that it's modeled on a kind of computational machine, and it carries out a series of operations, basically responds to imperatives and commands, a whole complex, sophisticated range of imperatives and commands. So like something that Lucas said before, that and I'm just going to leave it there without explaining it, but the sort of the way to understand the virtual is that it's the next stage of managerialism, and here you do see a connection between bureaucracy and managerialism, which reduces language to command, instruction. You go do this now. Okay, if he says that, then you say this, blah blah blah. And the virtual, where it's about like signs like got run amok. They've gone kind of like wild, acting without any reference to the reality they're supposed to like represent or express. Okay, so I'm going to leave that there, but I'm going to focus on just another example, which is this. I'm going to link it to what Jakob was saying earlier. So what is the other form that how does this enter into the disciplinary practice? Well, it's a bit like the psychiatrist becomes a sort of voice coach for the patient. He treats him like his parrot, right? And he gets him to recite, to declaim certain lines. Now there is a kind of preliminary ascetic training for this. A kind of hilarious moment. You've got like Dupre sitting down like a schoolboy doing his Latin exercises. Like a kind of someone who's been kept behind for detention, has to write like lines or something. So he sends him back to school. And what he does, first of all, he disciplines him and he gets him to write down stories, or he gets him to recite verse, i.e. somebody else's words, or he gets him to speak in Latin, i.e. a language that's not his own. And these are all like preliminary or preparatory procedures that kind of loosen him from his madness, that kind of like separate him from his delirium. And then you have like the second stage, which is where now, and these are the exact words I want you to speak. All right. So and now we don't get much of this in Foucault, because Foucault does that. He lays emphasis on one place and then he just mentions another place, but he talks about this idea of the interrogation, okay, and that Jakob touched on earlier. Now, what is the point of the interrogation when the scenario in which the psychiatrist poses questions that are meant and that the patient gives answers, and they're usually questions about himself? But Foucault makes it clear this is a kind of simulation. He doesn't want knowledge. He doesn't need knowledge. All that this is meant to do is to show the patient that the psychiatrist already has more knowledge than he has. Okay, that the psychiatrist already knows everything there is to know about the patient. You know, that the patient cannot surprise the psychiatrist with any new knowledge about himself. Okay. So what it does, this act of interrogation, where let's say, where are you from? Okay, no, I know that's not the right answer. Come on now, stop mucking me around. Where are you from? Okay, that's good. Yeah. And how old are you? When were you born? No, come on now, that's not true, is it? You know, okay, I was born, blah, blah, blah. What's the point in this? Well, the point is to create a kind of like an alignment or synchrony between the master and, you know, his, I don't know what word for it, his victim, let's say. And I actually think this is the form that like modern schooling takes. You'll get, like, for example, okay, so we've got a question about Macbeth and his ambition. You know, what are the sorts of quotes we might use for this question? You know, and someone put up their hand, and it won't be like an investigation. You know, it won't be a quest into the text of Macbeth where the students are meant to come up with like surprise answers that come out of their own spontaneous invention and reflect their own like personal engagement with the work. You know, it will always be an answer that they were taught like last lesson or the week before. You know, so he'll put up his hand. He'll be like, oh, we could say, like, you know, Matt, ambition takes over him and he goes crazy and he says, oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife. You know, and he'll be like, okay, good, well done. You know, and if they get the answer wrong, it's like, no, that's not right. I wouldn't use that one. You know, so the purpose there, again, is like another like analogy is that the teacher or the psychiatrist or anyone who's in charge in these individual situations, the person that writes the confession becomes a kind of ventriloquist. Okay, a ventriloquist that kind of like, you know, that scripts. On the one hand, scripts the thought, the responses that the patient is supposed to give, but in and through that molds, marshals, and kind of like shapes their subjectivity into an institutionally acceptable form. And, like, you know, you get points for emulation, you get points for approximation, you get points for the answer that resembles the teacher's answer, the one that the teacher has in his top pocket in the kind of like, you know, in a magic notebook. And I don't know, I don't want to go on, like, you know, too much on this, but it means that, like, there's an incredibly soft form of discipline that's now everywhere, and it's almost like discipline, and you can see it in the park, you can see it on the streets. You know, it's discipline as checking. Okay, now checking is actually a really incredibly rich word already. You know, checking is in like, I'm checking, making sure you got the right answers. But to check someone is also to stop them in their path, you know, to get in their way. And of course, like, check in chess is a kind of like threatening move, you know, one that exposes the king. Anyway, so it's a fundamental discipline as checking. Now, if you think about, like, the teacher is checking that the students have the right answers, not producing an environment in which their intelligence can flourish. Okay, the psychiatrist is checking that the patient is giving the right answers, that announce that he's making progress towards, you know, release from his madness. And in ordinary life, in social life, we're often checking that people haven't got like radical opinions or weird ideas, you know, and they don't, like, you know, as we said in another like seminar, give us the ick. You know, they're making sure, are you acceptable? You know, am I going to risk anything by this relationship with you? Is this like conversation going to taint me in some way or come back to haunt me later on? I need to make sure, I need to check you, you know, first of all. Yeah, so just this idea of a choreographed questioning that does something to language. And I was thinking about this in terms of what is this polymorphous naming? Well, for me, like, in physics, we've got the collapse of the wave function, and, you know, in in language, we've got something like the collapse of the metaphoric function. Okay, so metaphors are banned. All right, and I think this is actually an interesting. Like we've talked before about the academia has become bureaucratized, not only at the level of the institution, but at the level of thought. Okay, thought itself is bureaucratized, and like in the way, for example, the academic articles are laid out, they've got loads of headings and they've got abstracts which tell you what you're about to see, and then in the paper itself, it's like, I will argue this, and then that is constantly kind of arranging itself, almost like filing itself away, But another way in which it's bureaucratized is that metaphor is kind of is treated like a kid is at school, or like the mad person is in the asylum. Metaphor is given a diminished value. In academic articles, metaphor is okay if it's a pedagogical device, okay? If it helps you to understand the argument, but the argument itself is sovereign, is where the important point is made. Metaphor is okay if it's meant to make the text easier to read, jollier to read, as a bit of garnish, or a kind of decoration, or a little bit of embroidery. But it does not make a point itself. Metaphor does not itself speak, And in school too, in exams, you cannot use metaphor. Like, you cannot say that, Macbeth's kind of like, ambition is possessive in the way that, like a miser, who's so like anxious about losing his money that he dare not even look inside his own purse to see how much is there, which is like a kind of incredible metaphor that one kid once said to me. This idea of you're so scared, you're so miserly that you don't even know how much money you've got. And possessiveness is a bit like that. You get 0 points for that in the exam. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't count. Because what counts is this other form, discourse. Now, Luke is often like talking about like celebrating Foucault as this master craftsman of language, and it's absolutely right. But there's also a sense in which he's in some way toned down his language in this work. But if we think that he's simultaneously writing allegories, then he is actually secretly, surreptitiously reintroducing that metaphoric function, So fine, he performs the disciplinary procedure on himself, which also involves subjecting himself to a kind of linguistic orthopedics, But then, in a more subtle, sly, mischievous way, metaphor re-enters in the form of this allegory, the absolute transposability of these insights, the transferability of these theories, the fact that they can be read as obliquely about, other walks of life, about massive things like the organization of society, and tiny moments like our relationship to our own guilt, or our relationship to our own girlfriend or son or whatever it is. There's a kind of a lot there, but.
Can I say something brief?
Yeah,
It's just a remark, and then Luke, if you have stuff, you can go. But it's just
I'm gonna have to like dash in a sec, but yeah.
Yeah. No, but just briefly on this topic, I don't know much about it, but my understanding is that there is this kind of strain I think in psychiatric history, psychoanalytic history, and psychology, like function as such, where schizophrenia, right? I mean, we don't know at this point what Dupré would be. What is he? We don't know, but there is its tendency to, or has been, and I think it's maybe, I'm not sure if it's up now for. Is it contested? Is it not? Where do we stand now? But schizophrenics have been seen as having a problematic relationship to language and words. As such, there's been many people, I think, who've made this connection. I can't name them, but I'm sure that I'm really certain that there is this, long history of viewing that, and then you have people who opposes it and says, no, that's not really true. That's a matter of understanding language and da. But this is even before we have this history, right? And already here it's kind of taking place, right? Or it's being enacted and all this stuff. I would be super interested to look into that, but it's just a remark.
It reminds me of like the beginning of capitalism and schizophrenia,
Yeah.
Where Deleuze identifies a certain kind of poetry with schizophrenia. I can't remember how he does it because I've read that.
I mean, he's like, and he goes and he never stops and he never structures.
Mate, Anthony Artaud.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
No,
always
but
just like, oh Jesus.
Yeah.
No, but I was just gonna say, there was an incredible amount in what Patrick said, and I guess like what comes back to me over and over again is this sense of, okay, so there is language, right, and there are words, and so this takes us like right back to the beginning of Foucault's work, les mots et les choses, words and things, naming, pointing. Now, at the same time, there is dramaturgy. You use this word dramaturgy. Now, later in his work, he will create a portmanteau between aletheia and dramaturgy and call it alethergy, right? Which is like the kind of ritual manifestation or display of truth. And so what's interesting? So there are, I guess I want to do two things at the same time. On the one hand, I think the kind of like linguistic register is really important. And so I was just thinking about like check, the word check, right? And it is a very rich word, as you hinted at. But then it's also related to other words that are equally rich, like mark, right? So like check, mark, but then also brand. And there are like all sorts of really complex and fascinating ways in which these words come into life, come into like social being, come into existence. So for example, you go into school and they have a register and they call your name and you announce your name, right? So again, it's linking this thing about like pointing, about a certain form of submission that's or obedience, or dominance that is manifested, well, at least in the first place, between a certain like connection between words and things, like Mr. Schill, yes sir. Dr. Verge, yes sir. Now that's a check that becomes a mark, right? It becomes like a mark in a register. And then what I always kind of think about Foucault, and this is dimensions again that he will go into later in his work, but is that you have mark, check, but then you have the more severe form to brand. And then brand is also this incredibly rich word, right? Especially in, if you think of our work for Emersham's death, and I looked at maybe 100 or 200 of those videos, of like self-improvement, or well, what's a big part of those videos? It's creating your own brand, right? Branding yourself, being a brand. And that's actually when Foucault is going to revolutionize the understanding of neoliberalism in 1977. He does so precisely in this way. So what Foucault does is he moves the understanding of neoliberalism away from the kind of like David Harvey, Piketty, the general perspective. And in fact, now like Foucault's perspective is very commonplace. It's like Varoufakis has it, all sorts of like mainstream economists like Piketty have kind of adopted it in the end. But so before, like neoliberalism was this idea that, okay, so we have to like spend nothing on the state, and but what Foucault made the point of is that no, like what neoliberalism is fundamentally about is modes and modalities of subjectivization. And those modes of subjectivization are where you become an entrepreneur of yourself. And I remember Patrick like saying something to me quite brilliant when I was rejected from a position in France. And he talked about contemporary academia. And he was like, well, contemporary academics, they're just entrepreneurs of research funding. And there is an important sense in which that's true. Like we've just experienced with the artwork, for example. In a certain sense, you have to like promote yourself to this body. You have to be like a kind of brand. You have to brand yourself, and then you have to articulate like a certain kind of like language that to them is legible. That to them is readable. That to them gives them the hook or the sense, or like whatever it is that they need to kind of move forward or progress. And so I just think like in between that there's a lot of fascinating things, but I think the kind of and I would love to do these kinds of studies. Like I would love to go into classrooms, for example, and see how in normal life, in everyday life, these words kind of interact, because they're very close. Check, mark, brand. Now, whether or not that's in it's also in sports, right? So like like check yourself, which means like kind of like calm yourself down, like revert to your role. and then you could also say like, check yourself. You're supposed to be marking that guy, in football, for example. And so I think the close like semantic net of these notions, check, mark, and brand, is really beautiful and really fascinating.
Also,
And-
a marked man.
Yeah. To be a marked man, to be hunted, which and then again, like it's something that I'd have to really look into and explore. But well, to be a marked man is to be a man that's not yet been branded with the act, right? So the act is, let's say they beat you up, or they kill you, or they in some way violate you. Well, that's the branding. That's the action of branding, but the action comes after being marked, and then that kind of integrates with this notion of check-in, and then all of this conversation, it just kind of takes me back to what I was talking about before, and maybe we will go to as we move through his work, maybe we will go right back to the start, and we'll look at l'histoire de folie and les mots et les choses. Maybe that'll be interesting. Let's see, as things develop. But however, kind of it brings back to this fundamental thing, and then just the last kind of the other thing that I had to say about that was this notion of like interrogation. Now, I kind of took this huge risk in my dissertation for my master's at Oxford, and I decided to teach myself Wittgenstein. Now, if you want to know a kind of like form of masochism, it's teaching yourself Wittgenstein. It was fantastic. But specifically, I was speaking about the methodology of the interview. Now, this was before my kind of like big aventure amoureux with Foucault. And it seemed to me that the very notion of like an interview, where it's constituted by all those domains of power, such that it almost renders the datum of the interview like ridiculous or absurd, because really what the interview speaks, what the interview says is, well, what is the expected response, like in a certain way. And so I was just thinking about like Wittgenstein, and we were talking about metaphysics and how Wittgenstein, Nietzsche. I mean, it begins with Kant in an important sense, but there's this abandonment of metaphysics, right? So, like in Kant, that emerges in the unknowability of the condition. So like the fact that we know things means that we cannot know how we know. In Nietzsche, he very explicitly advocates for like an abandonment of metaphysics. In Heidegger, of course, like phenomenology to the things themselves, that's kind of the last turn or the last corner in the abandonment of metaphysics. It's like, look, there are things that constitutionally we cannot know. And we cannot know them precisely because we can know things. And so we cannot have like a knowledge that exists prior to or outside of knowledge itself. And so, yeah, so I just thought that was like a really fascinating thing. And then the other part that really I haven't thought about before, but I also found really fascinating, is that, well, there's actually a slight divergence here. Because on the one hand, yes, there is this thing, and it's all about language, and it's about like denotation, and it's about pointing, it's about naming, it's about labeling, and then these forms of denotation, pointing, naming, labeling, well, they become enwrapped in these structures of power, domination, control, etc. But then there's also dramaturgy, i.e., there is also acts, ritual acts that, yes, language is a part of them. However, the acts themselves are far in excess of language. And I kind of play with this a little bit in that chapter I wrote, Sacrifice, the Gift, and League of Exclusion. So, I wasn't just talking about the Aztec sacrifice in the way that I did to be provocative or, to be bait or, that was a big part of it, because, of course, it was a dramaturgical act. It was for a seminar in the law faculty. But, these things when they talk about, and like, for example, the children, and they all went cheering, and the children will be on the shoulders of warriors. And they said, and if their tears fell, if their tears rolled, yes, very well, it will be a good year. We will have rain this year. We will have rain like the tears fall from the children. These children who are going to be sacrificed in this kind of like incredibly brutal way. Now, there is something about like when I recount what I did with the work of Bernardino de Sahugen, probably the first anthropologist in the world, and so when I like edit his it's from like 6 or 7 or 8 books. So it's called A General History of the New Things of Spain, I think. So I rearrange these and edit these, and I make them into like a dramaturgical form, and but there is something about that dramaturgy that even though that language provokes, even though that language incites, even though that reading out these words and kind of reading them in a very Foucauldian, it was a very Foucauldian thing that I was doing. It was very much a discipline and punish kind of maneuver, right? But even in the start of Discipline and Punish, that we've talked about before in previous seminars, and that we will, of course, come on to read. In Discipline and Punish, there is a certain sense in which the dramaturgy is excessive of language, and that to I guess connect it with like Deleuze and the notion of desire and lack, that there is a certain way in which the world lacks language. And so the imposition or inscription of language onto the world, well, it takes these huge, grandiose dimensions of the Aztec sacrifice, or of the, of the punishment of Damion the regicide. And then that links into something that, I often talk to about Patrick, like vis-a-vis, knowing like a few different languages, and the way that, English is such a beautiful language because it's a kind of gambit with the world. Right, like English kind of me and Patrick have talked a lot about onomatopoeia. So the usual notion of onomatopoeia is that it's something that can be identified in a text. Again, it can be checked, it can be marked, and like woof, for example, right? So it's like the sound sounds like the word, but actually, so much of English tends to onomatopoeia, and it's like English. It has this like flexibility and versatility and dynamism, precisely because it's a kind of gambit with the world. It's a kind of gambit in which it admits always its own inadequacy. It admits its own inadequacy to point and say, this is this. And that to me is where English is greatest and most beautiful. Just again, like to recount the start of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which I think is a masterpiece, of course. It was on the edge of Barstow when the drugs took hold. What a fucking opening line. And what fundamentally is doing there is he's automatically invoking this sense of detachment, detachment of language. And he's doing it so dramaturgically. And I think you see a very similar thing in Moby Dick by Melville. Call me Ishmael, right? Call me Ishmael. I mean, like the richness of that. It is to me like the greatest opening line of anything ever made or ever created. And it is so precisely because he invokes this problematic relationship of language to the world, and he invokes so in like a temper which is already invoking questioning, like call me Ishmael. Well, it invokes all of these questions, like, well, who is he really, for example, by saying like call me Ishmael. And then also there's a very richness of the fact that he says call me, and then the notion of like calling and being called. That's a huge area of thought and philosophy that we could kind of go into. So anyway, I just thought that it was kind of fascinating on many different levels, in rich and textured ways that links right back to the start of Foucault's work, and it links to Wittgenstein in profound ways, which is like naming, pointing, marking, checking, branding, and they evoke these like really profound metaphysical questions. And then I think it links to what Patrick was saying, in that, well, these two kind of like categories that he's invoked, metaphor and allegory. And I always remember because he tells this story over and over again, but it's a good story. And it was when we were both working at the same school, and he was trying to give a lesson on metaphor. And he went to the lady who was the head of English, and he was like, these kids don't have a fucking clue about like what metaphor is. And she was like, well, of course they do. We did it last term. Like, you can look in the manual, like it's there. Again, it's checked, marked, ticked, almost branded. We have made this connection, and these two things, just to kind of like finish this diversion. These two things, metaphor and allegory, are both ways, in a certain sense, in which this like gambit with the world, in which this thing that English does, right, which this tendency to onomatopoeia, this like way in which English has like a tentative relationship. And I think that's what makes Foucault's work really difficult to read in English, because it's French. Now, French is all about kind of order, structure, like, you know. I remember I listened to some like French hip hop that a friend of mine was like, yeah, this is the shit. And I was like, this is terrible. But it was terrible to me because I didn't understand the French language enough to see the kind of like versatility, playfulness, the rebelliousness, you know, the way in which they used words in a certain way. And da, da, da. But these two things, metaphor and allegory, are almost ways of like kind of carrying or like mediating that gap, right, between the things that we point at and can name and say, yes, that's that, or yes, that's this. Whereas metaphor and allegory, well, they occupy this kind of strange status. You know, they occupy this strange status in life. Like, I mean, I know exactly what I mean when I say I'm talking about metaphor or allegory. Yet if you ask me to describe what a metaphor or allegory is, I would have no idea. Zero. Absolute, you know, like degree point zero. And I think that part of the reason for that is because they exist in this like indeterminate mediating space, which is what I think English as a language in its kind of rich, beautiful history exists in. It exists in a mediating space between the world. You know, it's not like the exact opposite of English is German, right? You know, so we've talked about German before. So, you know, in German, they have concepts like Schadenfreude. Now, Schadenfreude we can explain, we can delimit, we can demarcate, very much like we can with like hygge in Danish, right? You know, like a lot of people are mistaken because of the zeitgeist around it. But if you've lived in Denmark, you know exactly what hygge is. You know, like this sense of like comfort, familiarity, routine, ritual, but then with like a kind of like decoration given to it. You know, so like you know, my ex-girlfriend Maria, it would be like we'd have breakfast, and to me it was the most ridiculous thing. She would light candles for our breakfast. You know, and I was like, what the fuck is going on? So that's hygge. You know, like, and I remember staying with you, Jakob, and Max, you know, the French chef, who was getting pissed off. And I myself pissed off, you know, because I saw what was going on, and it was Tia, and she'd made you this like beautiful spread of breakfast, and you know, you were together in the kitchen, and I was like, oh, you know, I'll fuck off because they're having this like, you know, really lovely moment together, and you know, let them have that, let them savor it. Whereas Max was being, you know, a cunt and like bolshing about, and, you know, but like. Anyway, you know, the point is that there is something in English that ironically becomes incredibly denotational, precisely in and through its relationship to these things like metaphor, allegory, onomatopoeia, and I think that is a big difference. Like the obvious opposition is German, but you also find this like in French. You know, I believe. Where you know they think that you can like contain the world within language.
Yeah. I mean, I've got loads to say, obviously, but I do have to go. But
It's 2.5 hours now.
Yeah. But just there's this, like, I feel like all English words, it's the relationship between dramaturgy and onomatopoeia, is that all English words await pronunciation, you know? And so if you just think, like, they need to be said, declaimed, you know, almost like, you know, voiced. And the reason why there's this like uncanny thing in English that lots of words are like sound the same as their meaning is precisely because we exist as part of like a history, like we inherit language. And if you think about everyone who's ever pronounced the word, everyone who's ever said a word, if there's this imperative on performance in a language, every time they've spoken it, they've sculpted it with their voices, they've chiseled it with their voices, they've kind of reshaped it and refined it with their pronunciation. And there are loads like even like kind of like discombobulate itself, you know, and they go boom boom boom, you know, like is itself a kind of state of concussion,
discombobulate,
or like the mix of like grace and silliness to the word whimsical, you know, that kind of like a little you know schoolgirl clicking her heels, you know, and
or gay, you know.
Yeah, all right, yeah, there
like
you go, yeah. And anyway, they're just like a thousand kerfuffle, you know, like, you know. Again, I'm not like he's onomatopoeic, like it's just. And
it's such a good word. Sorry, I just fucking love kerfuffle.
And then there's another category of words which are like they allow you again. So this is the relationship between dramaturgy and onomatopoeia. They allow you to enact the emotion they express. So like scorn, you know, saying the word scorn allows your face to become scornful in a way. It allows you to do something to your lips which imitates the sneer of scorn. Sneer being another word like that, I think. And I don't just think this is random. I think that there is there's a way of normalizing it or explaining it, is that English has always been reliant upon a moment of performance. It's never been, the book has never been enough. Inscription has never been enough. They're just notes for a future performance. English is fundamentally a spoken language, and which is why it's a compilation of dialects already. It isn't actually a formalized language. It's just a hodgepodge of different dialects that kind of like steal and cannibalize and metabolize one another. And what was I going to say? And I think that's just part of the whole English cosmology. Think about in English law, thing that we like talking about again, Luke, this idea of the criteria of reasonableness. So that doesn't exist in French law. French law is by the textbook, does this particular incident conform to this particular law, or does it violate this other law? How do we place this incident here that's allegedly a crime in the system of law? Whereas the English system has this ambiguous terrain where you have to prove to people that you're applying the law reasonably, or that you're understanding the law with reference to this criterion of reasonableness, i.e. the law is again always something that is preliminary to performance. It's never fixed. It has to prove itself on every new case. So again,
it's funny not to interrupt your flow.
Yeah, do, because I've got to go.
I am. No, it's what's fascinating about that is that when you watch the news now, right? So I often talk about this tendency to do superlative as a bad thing. So chaos, for example, my mum, my stepdad, they'll be in a car park and there's not a car parking space and it's chaos. And I'm like, well, if chaos fucking arrives, what are you going to have left? How are you going to talk about the arrival of the Antichrist? When
you've used all
not
your
being
coins.
able to find the parking space is chaos. But no, it was interesting because one of the ways that this manifests itself in English in British politics is first we have to be clear. So we have to be clear. I'm going to be clear. Now, I mean, if you were to do that, there is this way. Actually, I need to speak to one of my lecturers about how you find this out. He's got a really cool name. He's called Professor X. Professor Stefan X. He's really brilliant. Reader of Foucault. His anthropological work is about wrestlers in North India near Delhi.
Sure, I've got to go.
But
I've got to go.
All right. Peace out.
Yeah, I need to get the kids are not asleep, so I need to go.
All
right. Well, peace, guys. Yeah, lovely as usual.
Yeah. Thanks for a good session.
Yeah, cool. See ya.
All good. And I was just gonna kind of I shouldn't have fucking interrupted his flow because I didn't know I needed to go so quick. But just very quickly is that this thing, and it's huge in British politics, right? So it's a bit recently there's been a lot of recounting about Margaret Thatcher, and part of that recounting is possibly the most famous phrase that she's known for, and it relates to this thing called a U-turn, right? Which is kind of a discursive device to accuse, to do the kind of verbal kung fu that I talk about a lot in my work. Now, Thatcher, the genius and brilliant woman that she was, and that is undoubtable. I do not like her. I fucking hate her. I despise her politics. It doesn't stop her from being a brilliant fucking genius. And there was a moment, and it was just before her demise, and she said in the media, she said, "You turn if you want to. This lady is not for turning." And what's funny about the kind of the development of Anglo-Saxon politics in general, you tune into Sky News, BBC News, it doesn't matter what news source, anything that's coming from the Anglo-Saxon English-speaking world. Now, the amount of times that you will hear the word clear is just insane and fucking annoying. You know, let's be clear. I'll be clear. We'll be clear. And then, but the thing is it kind of like devolves into we're going to be crystal clear. And then it becomes we're going to be absolutely crystal clear. And then we're going to be non-negotiably absolutely crystal clear, right? So this is kind of funny thing in which, okay, they've gone to the superlative of let's be clear, but then in some way, and this links to what I was saying about the kind of non-denotational character of the English language, right? In which it's not about kind of like pointing to things and saying what they are. And I think that's precisely why the revolution in philosophy in language comes from German, where you can absolutely point to a thing and say what it is. And that's like part of the German language. Which, you know, we will talk about that later when we talk about that Baudrillard, and you know, it's kind of like precision and but yeah and anyway, I just thought it was interesting that when people try and be denotational in English, they end up kind of resorting to this like superlative, and then it dissolves to like, you know, adjectives, you know. So it's like clear, let's be clear, right? So it's like, okay, so we're all clear, we're being clear. I know, but now we have to be crystal clear.
Yeah, I don't know
I
about
know, but now we have to be absolutely crystal clear. But now we have to be absolutely non-negotiably crystal clear, right? You know, and it's kind of like chaos in the same way, right? Chaos has the same like function in ordinary everyday language. So, you know, people say, oh, you know, well, oh, this is chaos, and then it's absolute chaos, and then it's absolute total chaos, right? And there's something in there about the non-denotational nature of the English language, which ironically, for some reason, that, you know, I haven't really begun to think of. But then ironically, English becomes the, you know, and again, there's a kind of irony here, right? English is the lingua franca of the world, right? Now, lingua franca is French. And French was previously literally the lingua franca. You know, it was the language of the diplomacy. But you look at the ICJ, and yes, you know, they have all the hearings in French, but everyone's presenting in English. Everyone's talking in English. And so there's some kind of like, I don't know, like cruel irony or some way in which English goes so much to being non-denotational that it comes back to being denotational. You know. And anyway, I just thought that all of those things were really interesting.
No, it's super interesting. But no, I have nothing, mate. It's time to close the shop. We're on 2 hours 40 minutes.
Yeah. Well, it was.
And I need to piss.
So we will see each other and everyone else next week.
Yeah, see you in a week.
It's going to get fucking sexy. Because it's going to be the conversation about women's hysterization of their sexual desires in combat with the physician. So,
yeah.
Oh yeah. It's going to get sexy. Like I said, you know, like Foucault, he has this thing happens in all of his lectures. First couple are like bada bing. And then you're like, oh, but what? And then he has like 6, and then the last 2 or 3 are just boom, 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 boom. So really looking forward to that, man.
Yeah,
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
And we'll see everyone next week.
Yeah, see you.